Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of the... Jesus Christ, Kevin, who wrote this episode. This is so long. We're going to be here for hours, Kevin. Look at this. That's double-sided. By the way, if you want to buy this this very script with my signature on it, which is going to make it more difficult to read, I should have done that after finishing the first page. You can at our merch store. All of the previous scripts are for sale as one of one. There's only one of these. There's only one of every one of them. So you can go there now and pick it up if you'd like to. This is 5 of America's Worst Miscarriages of Justice, written by Kevin, read by me. Format of the show, if you're brand new, have never read this before, we're going to read it together. Let's go. I don't know if you're all aware, but people really love crime and legal dramas. I know that probably comes as a shock to the audience of our true crime channel, but not only is this a popular genre, it's been popular for thousands of years. Really? I didn't know it'd been popular for thousands of years. My big crime series, I was super into CSI as a kid. However, for as much as people love consuming that type of entertainment, there's an element of the legal process that's rarely ever seen in fictional stories. Life-altering mistakes can be made. There's no episode of Columbo where Detective Columbo arrests the wrong person. There's no episode of Matlock where Matlock's client is convicted despite actually being innocent. In fact, you're more likely to see the exact opposite in these fictional settings. Criminals who escape justice due to some bullshit technicality, or Sherlock Holmes refusing to turn the guilty person into the police because he doesn't think they deserve to be punished. While they do occasionally exist, you rarely see examples of grave miscarriages of justice. I think you sometimes do, but then it's the whole... It's not in CSI or whatever. It's the whole show is about a miscarriage of justice.
We have something to talk about. I'm here to arrest you for the murder of your partner. What?
But while these are rare in the world of legal fiction, they are all too common in the real world. America's legal system has a long and storied history of failing the general public, especially when the people involved are not white. You might think that makes it sound like these stories are going to be relics of a different era, Simon. No, I think while we do live in a more equal society, and possibly, I don't know, it's really hard for me to comment as a white person, but I think we probably do live in a more equal society than in history, modern history now. But it's still super fucking broken. But most of the events we're talking about happened after you were born. So very, very recent, because I'm a young man. Emmett Till. Emmett Till was born on July the 25th, 1941, which is not nearly long enough ago for the type of story that this is about to be. As a frame of reference, Emmett was only 1 year older than President Biden. But President Biden's real old. Anyway, Emmett was born in Chicago, Illinois, to Lewis and Mamie Till, though he was mostly raised by his mother. His parents separated the year after Emmett was born when Mamie found out that Lewis had been cheating on her, and the following year Lewis assaulted Mamie, choking her unconscious. Fucking hell, Lewis, what the fuck? Mamie already had a restraining order on him at this point, so for violating the order, Lewis was given his choice of jail or the army. Lewis chose the army, and in 1945 he was court-martialed and executed while serving overseas. Holy shit, what the fuck? What? That's intense. What the fuck did he do? Mamie received notification of the execution, along with Lewis's personal belongings, most notably a ring engraved with his initials. At the time, she was simply told that Lewis had been executed for willful misconduct with no further explanation, though it appears he was court-martialed for murdering one woman and sexually assaulting 2 others while stationed in Italy. How's an execution on court-martial go? Do you have a jury in a court-martial? I don't think so, right? It's just like a military thing, and they're like, okay, kill him. That's really intense. The military's scary sometimes. When Emmett was 6 years old, he contracted polio. Although he survived the disease, it did leave him with a permanent stutter. In 1951, Mamie and Emmett moved to Detroit, where Mamie remarried, but Emmett preferred life in Chicago, so went back to live with his grandmother. Mamie and her new husband returned to Chicago later that year as well, but their marriage dissolved, and the stepfather returned to Detroit in 1952. While that sounds like a somewhat tumultuous childhood, indeed it does, Emmett was a happy kid and a born leader. He'd got lots of friends, and his mother believed that he was going to grow up to be a good lawyer or politician. Well, bright future ahead, except not, because this is called America's Worst Miscarriages of Justice. But he was still a kid, so Emmett and his friends and cousins were known for pulling childish pranks on one another. Even though neither of her marriages worked out, Mammy still described her life in Chicago with Emmett as being as close to perfect as you can get. Not only was Emmett happy growing up, but he was assertive and had tremendous confidence. This sometimes led him to overestimating his own abilities and biting off more than he could chew. But hey, that's how kids learn. Yeah, this is a pretty, sounds like a nice, if slightly tumultuous, but productive childhood. In 1955, Emmett's great-uncle, Mose Wright, came to visit the family. Mose lived in Mississippi, which is where Mammy had been born. She was part of the large migration of African Americans who left the South and moved north in search of a better opportunity and more equitable treatment under the law, but Mose had remained in Mississippi, where he worked as a sharecropper and a part-time preacher, which was also his nickname. Well, his nickname was just Preacher. It's kind of cool, to be honest. Emmett was fascinated by all the stories Mose told about Mississippi, so he wanted to visit for himself. It was eventually decided that Emmett would return to Mississippi with Mose. His cousin, Wheeler Parker, would join them for the trip, and another cousin, Curtis Jones, would follow shortly afterwards. However, Emmett was 14 years old now, so before he could visit Mississippi, his mother had to give him the talk. You probably assume this meant the sex talk. But not in the 1950s, it didn't. No, Mammy had to give her son the violent Southern racism talk. Oh my. Right, yes, that would be a thing. That's depressing. Of course, the idea of segregation wasn't exactly new to Emmett. Although segregation didn't exist as a matter of law in Chicago as it did in the South, redlining and housing covenants had barred black families from owning property in white neighborhoods. I think I've told this story before. I went to Atlanta. I have family in Atlanta. I went to Atlanta maybe, it was, I think, 2008-ish, and I wandered into the town, and my aunts who live out there, they were like, go see this exhibition about segregation. I'm like, okay. I didn't really know anything about this. I was like a 20-year-old guy, didn't have a lot of knowledge about American history. And I'm like, going down there, and I'm like, wait, why are all these fucking photos in color? Why is there the separate bathrooms, but a color photograph? And it's like, oh, because this was it was the 1970s or something. And I'm like, the fuck? I had no idea that this was happening so late. And I know to all Americans it's going to sound incredibly ignorant and all of that, but we don't learn about, at school I learn about English history and British history and all of that and all of the horrible that, my country's done. And I was just like, whoa. It really, really surprised me. Officially, schools were integrated, but what school you attended was determined by where you lived. This resulted in the de facto segregation of schools, as school districts would assign black neighborhoods to one school and white neighborhoods to another. Emmett was also a big baseball fan, and he and his friends would play pickup games of baseball whenever they got a chance. I don't know what a pickup game is. I've heard that phrase many times, pickup game. And I'm like, it sounds, if someone said a pickup game of basketball, I'd be like, so it's an American thing, yes. As such, they would have been fully aware that there were certain parks where black children were not allowed to play. Not because there were signs bordering the park that said whites only, but because they would have been met with hostility if they attempted to play ball on the wrong field. Oh, just to expand on my story of countries being racist, I then went to South Africa maybe 10 years after that, and I was like, wait, I was alive when this was happening? It's like, what the fuck? Still, none of this was comparable to what venturing to Mississippi was going to be like. In fact, that Emmett had experienced segregation at all may have been to his detriment, as it may have given him a false sense of what to expect. As I said, Emmett was confident and assertive, and that was no way for a black person to behave in the South. Mammy told him about all the social norms they would have to adhere to in order to stay out of trouble during his visit. He was never to speak to a white person unless spoken to first, and even then it was only, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, no, sir, no, ma'am. If he was walking down a sidewalk and a white woman was approaching, he was to step off the sidewalk and lower his head, never looking at her. Mammy told him, if you have to humble yourself, then just do it. Get on your knees if you have to. Well, fuck this shit. When Emmett protested slightly, claiming that things in Mississippi couldn't possibly be as bad as she was making them out to be, Mammy told him that they were much worse. Even though she was doing her best to teach him exactly how to behave to stay out of trouble, she wondered if it would be enough. After all, she'd never had to explain anything like this to him before. As she put it, quote, how do you give a crash course in hatred to a boy who has only known love? Wow, that's a really nice quote. Ultimately, though, Mammy decided that it would be fine. She told Emmett everything that she could to try and prepare him, and he was only going to be there with family who understood how things worked in the South. Surely they would be able to keep him from getting into trouble. But before he left for Mississippi, there was something that Emmett wanted. He had admired the engraved ring that belonged to his father, and he wanted to wear it in Mississippi to show off, and possibly to remember his father as well, but Emmett had barely known the man, so it was probably just for the aesthetics. Mammy gave him the ring, and then all that was left to do was ride the train to Mississippi for the 2-week stay with Mose. Emmett arrived in Mississippi on August the 21st, 1955, staying with his uncle on a plantation outside of the town of Money. Money. The warnings that Mammy had issued probably give you some idea of what the South was like, but I should really give you a little bit more context. After the Civil War, the 15th Amendment was ratified. This amendment barred federal and state governments from abridging a person's right to vote on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That was all well and good in theory, but there were plenty of ways to abridge the rights of black voters without explicitly being tied to race. The two biggest were poll taxes and literacy tests. All right, both of which could be avoided thanks to the grandfather clause. This is all very complicated. I don't know what a poll tax is. I don't know what the grandfather clause is. Literacy test is obviously about literacy. States like Mississippi would set up literacy tests that the person had to pass in order to vote, but anyone whose grandfather had been legally allowed to vote would be grandfathered in and not have to take the tests or pay the tax. Well, that's just a way to apply a rule from the past in the present day, right? The racist rule of black people not being able to vote, because obviously their grandfathers couldn't vote. That's just going to be white people. How is this allowed? It was a fun legal loophole that allowed states to bar black people from voting without explicitly doing it on the basis of color, even if the intention was really clear. And if your reaction to that was that people should just pass the literacy test if they want to vote, well, you couldn't pass. The tests were made as confusing as possible, had potentially impossible time limits, and a single incorrect answer meant failure. If that wasn't bad enough, many questions were also arguably subjective, which is not something that should exist on a test unless it's a long-form essay answer. For example, take the question, write the word backwards, forwards. Okay. What? Write the word backwards, what question? What does that even mean? I am literate. I promise you I'm literate. Might not be much more than literate, but I can read. A real question that appeared on an Alabama literacy test. Personally, I read the question as them wanting you to take the word forwards and write it backwards. Yeah, that's what I would say. SDRAWROF, right? But you could easily read it as them wanting you to take the word backwards and write it forwards. Well, backwards is already forward, so then they'd just be asking you to reprint the word backwards, which is confusing. Since the question could be read either way, then a person could be failed regardless of which answer they put. I could go on about these tests, but you can find plenty of YouTube videos dissecting just how f***ed up and impossible they were. After you finish this video, that is, of course. Watch time. Anyway, Money was located in Tallahatchie County, a county in which 56% of people of voting age were black. Despite being the majority, as of 1955, not a single black person had ever voted in the county. That was 85 years after the constitutional amendment granting them the right to vote, so clearly these restrictions had proven effective. That's incredible. Like, incredibly bad. Obviously. That's not... I don't know why I needed to qualify that. That's incredible. I can't believe these geniuses worked out a way to finally stop black people from voting. Incredible work, boys. A week before Emmett arrived in Money, about 2 hours away in the city of Brookhaven, the black activist Lamar Smith was shot and killed in front of the county courthouse for trying to help black people register to vote. 3 men were arrested, but they were all released without a trial. This was also 1 year after the landmark Supreme Court case of Brown and Board of Education. The 1986 case of Plessy and Ferguson had established the separate but equal standard of racial segregation, stating that segregation was not unconstitutional so long as facilities for both races were of equal quality. In the 1954 case, however, the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal was inherently unequal, and states were ordered to desegregate their schools with all deliberate speed, which is too vague of a term. That ruling created a lot of animosity in the South, and the phrase, all deliberate speed, yes, gave them a lot of leeway. Yes, easily predictable there. People were vehemently opposed to desegregating schools, and they feared that if schools were desegregated, it would only be a matter of time before the NAACP, right? That's the pronunciation of that? Took over and started desegregating everything. Can't be having that, can we? And in the interest of fairness, school segregation wasn't entirely a Southern problem. Boston didn't get around to desegregating schools until the 1970s, and only because the courts came in and forced them to do so by taking control of the schools themselves. Regardless, this was the environment Emmett was walking into. Segregation was the law of the land, and racial tensions were peaking thanks to Brown and Board of Education. Not only were activists being shot on courthouse steps, but Mississippi had the highest number of lynchings of any state, followed closely by Georgia. And amidst all of this was Emmett, happily picking cotton with his cousins and his uncle while he experienced Southern life for the first time. For the first few days, things went fine. He picked cotton, he swam in a snake-infested pond and shot off fireworks. I don't like the snake-infested ponds. Just typical rural activities. What'd you get up to this weekend? I just went for a swim in the snake-infested ponds. Like usual.
Someone get this bloody thing off my freaking hand!
It wasn't until August the 24th, Emmett's fourth day in Mississippi, that things took a turn. The day began as normal with Emmett picking cotton. After working, they drove into Money and went to Bryant's grocery and meat market to get some candy. The store was owned by 24-year-old Roy Bryant and his wife, 21-year-old Carolyn. It primarily serviced sharecroppers, so it's a pretty normal place for them to go. Emmett was there with his cousins Curtis Wheeler and Simeon Wright. They hung out outside the store for a few minutes, then Emmett followed one of the other boys inside. The other boy made his purchase, after which Emmett was left in the store with Carolyn, who was working alone that day, while Roy was out of town on business. What exactly happened inside the store is unknown, and is the source of much debate. Less than a minute after Emmett was left alone in the store, Simeon went inside as well. He saw Emmett innocently paying for his things, and then they left the store together. We'll get to what allegedly happened inside soon enough, but there's a general consensus about what happened once everyone was outside. Okay. Carolyn walked out of the store, through the crowd of boys, and went to her car to retrieve her handgun. What is happening? As she was walking to the car, Emmett whistled at her. That's how most people described it anyway, though one witness claimed Emmett was actually whistling at a game of checkers that was going on outside the store. That sounds like a pretty weak excuse. Also, I mean, do I think it's nice to whistle at women? Obviously not. Do I think it's, I assume, something that should lead to violence? No. Mammy had taught Emmett to whistle as a way to overcome bouts of stuttering, so it has been speculated that he may have whistled for that purpose as well. I'd argue that whistling at the game of checkers is possible if something cool enough happens in the game, but the stuttering alibi makes less sense. Mammy described teaching him to do a low whistle when he was stuttering, but everyone identified the noise as being the stereotypical wolf whistle used to harass pretty women. They also identified that it didn't matter why Emmett had made the sound, because they had to get the out of town immediately before someone came to teach them a lesson. Yes, it's crazy, but yes. The group immediately ran to the car and drove back to Moses' home, where they were initially terrified. It seemed all but certain that someone would come looking for them, but nobody came knocking. The first 24 hours were tense, but once nothing happened, they just kind of forgot about it. Unfortunately, what they didn't realize is that nothing had happened yet because Roy was still out of town. He didn't arrive back until the 26th, but Carolyn didn't tell him what had happened. She claimed this was because she feared that he would hurt Emmett if she said something. While it's true that Carolyn wasn't the one to tell Roy, I doubt it was actually Emmett that she was trying to protect. The couple eventually got divorced, with Carolyn claiming that Roy was physically and verbally abusive to her, so she was probably trying to protect herself. Right. Regardless, a lot of people were talking about what had happened. While Roy was working at the store, he was told about Emmett whistling at his wife, after which he demanded that she give him the story of what happened, the same story she'd later tell in court. According to Carolyn, when she and Emmett were alone in the store, he asked for some candy inside of a display. When she put the candy on the counter, Emmett allegedly grabbed her hand and said, "How about a date, baby?" Carolyn had to forcefully pull her hand back and attempt to walk away. It was then that Emmett grabbed her by the waist and told her, "You need to be afraid of me, baby. I've fucked white women before." This is all hearsay, right? We don't know if this actually happened. But even if it did, it's not... I doubt it's going to be enough to justify what I assume is coming. She claims that Simeon then ran into the store and grabbed Emmett's arm to drag him back outside, though Simeon disputed that version of events. He said that when he went into the store, there was nothing lewd or inappropriate going on. Emmett said he was just paying for some bubblegum, and then they walked out together. But according to Carolyn, the situation had terrified her to the point that she had to go to the car to get her gun. Now look, I don't know why Carolyn got her gun, but I find it a little hard to believe that if she was so terrified of this group of boys, that she would have calmly walked directly through them to get to her car. No, you'd just lock the door to the shop, wouldn't you? I also find it hard to believe that a 14-year-old boy, even a somewhat mischievous one, would act that way to a random adult woman. I agree, I don't think it's likely. I also do not think it is impossible. But again, it's just going to be one person's word against another. And I get a complicating factor here is going to be the fact that he's black and she's white, especially after his mother had done everything that she could to ensure that he was terrified of interacting with white people in Mississippi. He's 14 though. He's 14. I'm not saying it's impossible, as crazier things have happened, but it is definitely sus. Yep. Completely agree, Kevin. On the same page with you on that one. It's also unclear if that's even really the story that Carolyn told Roy. That was the testimony she gave in court, during which she claimed to have told Roy the same story. We'll get to why there's debate over whether or not she really had told that version of events to Roy in a moment, though. On Saturday, August 27th, Roy and his half-brother, John Millam, decided that they needed to teach Emmett a lesson. He's 14, guys, come on. As Roy later stated, to do nothing would have shown him to be a coward and a fool. That night, Roy and John began driving around searching for Emmett. Accompanying them was John Washington, a black man who performed odd jobs for Roy, and Carolyn may have been there as well. They spotted a black teenager walking along the road, so Roy ordered Washington to grab him and put him in the back of the trunk. Holy shit. That's a proper crime. That's kidnapping. After confirming that it was not the boy they were looking for, he was thrown from the truck. The boy hit the ground face first, knocking out his front teeth. You f***ing psychos. Over the course of the night and some aggressive interrogations, Roy and John learned that the boy who had offended Carolyn was one of 3 boys from Chicago, staying with Mose Wright. At around 2:30 a.m., they rolled up to Mose's home, shouting for the preacher to come outside. Mose came outside and was met by Roy and John, the latter of whom was armed with a gun and a flashlight. Roy demanded to talk to the fat boy from Chicago, and they began searching the house for Emmett. Once they found him, John aimed the flashlight at his face and asked if he was the N-word that did the talking down at Money. Emmett said, yeah, at which point John threatened to blow his head off for not responding with, yes, sir. He then ordered Emmett to get dressed and come with them. Before taking Emmett to the car, John made it clear to the 64-year-old Mose that if he told anyone what happened, he wouldn't live to see 65. Mose then heard what sounded like a woman's voice in the car, positively identifying Emmett, after which he was tied up and put in the back of the trunk, which drove away. Now, it's unclear exactly what happened over the next few hours, but at 6 a.m., witnesses saw a truck outside John's barn and heard what sounded like screaming and whipping coming from inside. There are varying accounts of how many people were involved, though all we can say for sure is that Roy and John were definitely there, and they absolutely brutalized Emmett. He was whipped, and his face was beaten very literally beyond recognition. The men went so far as to gouge out one of Emmett's eyes before shooting him in the head. Oh my god, no, I don't like that at all. I mean, obviously not, but holy shit, I assumed that Emmett was going to survive this somehow, kill them, or not kill them, or they were going to get killed, and then he was going to go to prison forever, and that was going to be the miscarriage of justice. This, are you going to tell me, Kevin, that these guys then get away with it? Because that would be extra specially fucked up. They then drove to the Tallahatchie River, stopping by a cotton gin to steal a 70-pound fan from the machine. Emmett's neck was then tied to the fan using barbed wire, and his corpse was tossed in the river. After Emmett was kidnapped, Mose had waited at the home for about 20 minutes, assuming that Emmett would be beaten and returned. But when Roy and John failed to return their victim, Mose went out searching for a few hours. He arrived back home at about 8 a.m., unsuccessful in his search. He had taken John's threat against his life very seriously, so he decided to call the police. When Emmett's cousin Curtis heard this, he decided to call the police himself. Curtis first called the LaFleur County Sheriff's Department, then called his mother back home in Chicago. She in turn called Mammy. LaFleur Sheriff George Smith went to question Roy and John, and they admitted taking Emmett, though they also said that they released him the same night. Somewhat surprisingly, George issued a warrant for the arrest of Roy, John, and Carolyn for kidnapping. Roy and John were arrested, though the warrant was never executed against Carolyn. It wasn't until 3 days later that some boys were fishing in the Tallahatchie River and saw a pair of feet sticking out of the water. Emmett's body was pulled from the water, and Mose was called to identify the body, but he couldn't. Emmett was so badly disfigured from the beating and bloated from the water that Mose couldn't even recognize him. The only way he was able to positively identify Emmett was by the engraved ring that he was wearing. With the body identified, Roy and John were charged with murder, which is excellent, as they should be. Let's get them on death row. They gouged out a guy's eye after kidnapping and then shot him in the head. This is some death penalty. We're also in the South, but I get the feeling that I'm going to be quite annoyed that that's not what happens. At first it appeared that justice was going to be served. Yay! After all, Roy and John weren't exactly popular, upstanding citizens. People referred to them as white trash and peckerwoods.
Who you calling spook, Peckerwood?
I don't know what a peckerwood is, but I guess it's some sort of white trash. In fact, when John's best friend was acquitted of the murder of a black gas station attendant the following year, a newspaper ran the headline, "Tallahatchie County acquits a peckerwood." Basically, Roy and John were the bottom rung of white society. Yeah, they definitely seem very, very, very trashy. There was even support from the state government, with Mississippi Governor Hugh White telegraphing the DA, urging vigorous prosecution of the case. Well, excellent work, Governor White. The DA went on to say, "Murder is murder, whether it is black or white, and we are handling this case like all parties are white." So long as we ignore the obvious racist undertones that still exist in that statement, this was a good thing. Yeah, it's the past, but he is trying to do the right thing here. A 14-year-old boy had been murdered, and the powers that be were interested in taking it seriously. However, in the weeks leading up to the trial, Mammy made 3 very important decisions. First, she demanded that Emmett's body be transported back to Chicago for a burial, defying the orders of the Tallahatchie County Sheriff, who wanted to keep the body there. Once she saw the remains of her son, she was horrified. His face was completely unrecognizable, with one eye missing and the other hanging out of the socket, resting midway down his cheek. His nose looked as if it had been sawed off, and when Mammy saw the bullet hole over his right ear, she remarked that she could see daylight on the other side. It was after viewing the body that Mammy decided that she needed to make something of this. As she said, "For him to have died a hero would mean more to me than for him to have just died." And so, despite the grotesquely disfigured state of Emmett's body, Mammy insisted that she was going to have an open casket funeral. Let the people see what they did to my boy. Emmett's body was on display for 5 days, with tens of thousands of people coming to pay their respects and see the horrors that had unfolded in Mississippi. Mammy had invited reporters from Jet magazine to the funeral as well, and they took a photo of her standing over Emmett's open coffin. She gave Jet permission to publish the photo so that the entire country could see what had happened. I won't make you look at the photo, Simon. Thank you, Kevin, since I know you're a bit squeamish. Yeah, I mean, it'd be a bit weird if you weren't squeamish around that sort of photo. And including the image will probably get this age-gated, but Emmett's face was barely recognizable as human. The decisions Mammy made resulted in national support and pressure for a conviction of Roy and John, but it also backfired a little bit as far as public sentiment in Mississippi was concerned. Roy Wilkins, the executive secretary of the NAACP, called Emmett's murder a lynching, adding, "The state of Mississippi has decided to maintain white supremacy by murdering children." Now, as anyone who's ever used social media can tell you, if there's one thing racists hate above all else, it's being called racist. While the people of Mississippi had initially been happy to throw a couple of peckerwoods to the wolves, and deservedly so, Wilkins' statement offended them so much that support started to rally behind Roy and John. The irony that this change in attitude was only proving Wilkins' point seemed to be completely lost on them. Probably because they're not that bright. More importantly, however, days before the grand jury trial, the Tallahatchie County Sheriff H.C. Strider publicly stated that he did not believe the body found in the water was actually Emmett. He claimed that the body looked more like that of an adult than a child, and that it was too badly decomposed to have only been in the water for 3 days, the length of time Emmett was missing. The sheriff also pointed out how Mose himself had difficulty in identifying the body. This probably got more to do with how badly he was beaten. The grand jury still indicted Roy and John, good, but the sheriff had already set up a murder defense for their actual trial, a defense that clearly had the support of the county's sheriff's office. George, the LaFleur County sheriff who'd arrested the men, said that all of this information was news to me, but since the crime took place in Tallahatchie County, he didn't actually have any say in the matter. Honestly, I'm not sure how he had the authority to arrest them in the first place, though I'm certainly not going to complain about that. Anyway, jury selection began in mid-September, and from that point on, the trial was doomed. I mentioned earlier that despite being a majority black county, there wasn't a single black person registered to vote in Tallahatchie. Oh, so they're also they can't be called for jury duty, right? This means there wasn't a single black person eligible for jury duty, as only registered voters could serve on a jury. It's the same thing in the UK. Like, we don't have civil juries, and juries are like more, for big criminal cases. But still, I didn't want to get called for jury duty, so I'm not registered to vote in the UK anymore, because that would be a hassle.
Voted? Who voted?
That already wasn't great for the prosecution, but things got worse. The defense was somehow able to work with Sheriff Strider to handpick the jury. Also, Sheriff Strider is way too cool of a name for what a piece of shit he was. Regardless, the jury consisted of 12 white men, all of whom were selected because they were known to be vehemently racist. Brilliant. According to one of the defense attorneys after the trial, quote, "After the jury was chosen, any first-year law student could have won the case." Once the jury was selected, it was time for the trial to begin. The The courthouse was packed to capacity with spectators and journalists, with hundreds more spectators waiting out on the lawn. The prosecution laid out its case against Roy and John, despite being hamstrung by the sheriff. What a dick. It's not your job, sheriff. What are you doing, you racist piece of shit? There were a couple of men who claimed to be witnesses to the events, but Sheriff Strider locked them in jail to keep them from testifying. Oh, you're a mega piece of shit, aren't you, Mr. Strider? Still, there were other witnesses to call, most notably Mose. Even though he had been too afraid to go to the police himself, Mose had come to accept that he had to testify, even if it meant his own death. It was a historic day in Mississippi, as Mose became the first black person to testify a white person in a trial that could result in the death penalty. He stood up in court and pointed at John to identify him. There he is.
There he is.
Over the first couple of days of the trial, the evidence and testimony against Roy and John was pretty conclusive. Yeah, and no one had any doubt that the men were guilty. That never changed, though the repercussions of their guilt may have been influenced by Carolyn's testimony. To be fair to the judge, he did rule that Carolyn's testimony was inadmissible. The prosecution objected to her being allowed to testify as to what had happened in the store between her and Emmett, so the judge only allowed her to testify with the jury out of the room. This is something that will happen in a trial when the relevance of a witness is uncertain. Basically, the witness gets to give their testimony, then the judge decides whether or not it's something that the jury needs to hear. And in this case, the judge felt that Carolyn's testimony was not relevant. Even if her account of Emmett grabbing her and making lewd comments was true, it had nothing to do with his murder. Sure, it established motive, but the motive behind Roy and John's actions was already known. A detailed account of exactly what Carolyn claims happened was completely immaterial and had nothing to do with whether or not the accused had committed the murder. But it didn't matter if the jury heard it or not, because the spectators and reporters heard it. In the unlikely event that any of the jurors hadn't already heard the details of Carolyn's story before the trial, they were certainly going to hear it before deliberation. Yeah, but they shouldn't. Shouldn't they mean like in sequestery? What's the word for being sequestered? In sequestery? I think it's just being sequestered, right? There's no sequestery.
Smart boy.
Of course, barring the jurors from hearing Carolyn's testimony may have been the only correct decision that the judge made. The courtroom was fully segregated, and the judge barred the black and white reporters from talking to one another. The reporters were all more than happy to ignore that order, but the judge still tried. Oh yes, and he also let the jurors drink beer throughout the trial, because, why the not? What? After the 5-day trial had completed, the jurors went to deliberate. Because this was a murder trial, there were only 3 options for the jury to agree upon: the death penalty, life in prison, or acquittal. It only took 67 minutes for the jury to return and say that Roy and John were not guilty. One of the jurors said, "If we hadn't stopped to drink pop, it wouldn't have taken that long." Bruh. In interviews given after the trial, all of the jurors made it clear that they knew Roy and John were guilty. Nobody in the courtroom had ever held any questions about their guilt. The only question was what verdict the jury would return. And even though they were guilty of sin, the jurors didn't feel that a white man should ever receive the death penalty or life in prison for killing a black person. You could feel that way all you like, piece of shit, but that's not what the law says. And it's a court and the jurors' responsibility to uphold the law, not their opinions.
Tell them.
Maybe if they had the option to give the men a small fine or upwards of a year in prison, they would have gone for that, but they were never going to agree to a conviction that carried a serious sentence. But now that they'd been acquitted of murder, it was time for Roy and John to go full O.J. Simpson. Since they were protected from further prosecution thanks to America's rule against double jeopardy, they agreed to sell their story to William Hugh of Look magazine for $4,000. That's over $47,000 today. Oh my god. The article was published barely 4 months after the men were acquitted, and in it, they fully admitted to murdering Emmett. Oh my god. That's insane. Of course, even though both men confessed to murder, their account of events is considered wildly inaccurate. While double jeopardy protected them from being charged again for the crime, they were the only 2 who'd been put on trial. As such, any other accomplices would still be open to prosecution on the basis of their statements. They were certainly aware of this, so they insisted they acted alone. Emmett was also portrayed as being completely fearless in the face of his kidnapping and assault, which didn't make much sense. He was a 14-year-old boy who was 600 miles from home and had just been kidnapped in the middle of the night by 2 adult men. But also, 14-year-olds can be, cocky. Nobody would be fearless in that situation. No, but you can be like, I'm not afraid of you. Which I don't know why this changes anything, but the article had to portray him as such in order to explain why Emmett wouldn't have just jumped off the back of the truck and run away, since Roy and John were both inside the cabin. They even went so far as to claim that, after already having been beaten within an inch of his life, Emmett bragged to his captors about f***ing white women. Unless Emmett actually wanted to die, his depiction in their confessions makes no sense. It was all constructed as a way to absolve any other co-conspirators of the murder. Even if they were covering things up, Roy and John had brazenly admitted to murder mere months after being acquitted. Isn't there a way around this? Substantial new evidence coming to light or something? Come on now. Come on. This sparked major backlash from the community that had supported them, a community that had never actually liked them in the first place. Roy's store was boycotted by the almost exclusively black clientele, and black sharecroppers refused to work on John's farm. Both men went bankrupt, though they unfortunately did manage to bounce back and get other jobs. It's a real shame. I kind of wish they just died in poverty, to be honest. Or in prison. Or being killed by the state. But even though the community was done with Roy and John, their acquittal at trial had sent a very clear message to the people of Mississippi. It was open season on killing black people. No matter how small an infraction a black person was believed to have committed, murdering them was now considered fair game on the basis that no white jury would convict a white person for murdering a black person. This led to a period of increased violence in Mississippi. Yeah, no because you've set an insane precedent legal system, particularly in areas like Tallahatchie County. On the national scale, however, Emmett's murder became a catalyst for change. This was such an obvious and inexcusable miscarriage of justice that it helped fuel the burgeoning civil rights movement, and it was one of the key factors in Congress passing the Civil Rights Act of 1957. This was more of a symbolic win, as it was fairly toothless, but it was still a step in the right direction for the civil rights movement and the eventual Civil Rights Act of 1964. Congress also passed an anti-lynching act. Brilliant. I mean, there wasn't that already? I thought murder was illegal. Named in honor of Emmett Till. Since 1892, there have been over 200 attempts at bills that would make lynching a federal crime, but they always failed because of resistance from southern states. I don't understand how you can be there and be like, do you think we're on the right side of history here, boys? And be like, yeah, we sure are, my brother. And be like, I don't know about this, guys. This doesn't seem like the right thing. I feel like we're the baddies.
Let's talk about Chinese people with their kung fu.
The Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act was finally passed by Congress and signed into law by President Biden in March 2022. Wait, what? Wait, what? No. What, Simon, did you expect better than that from the United States? What? What? I don't understand. The story didn't end after the civil rights movement, though. Instead, things would only get more complicated. John died of cancer in 1980 at the age of 61. Oh no! 5 years later, a journalist secretly recorded a conversation with Roy Bryant. The recording has never been made public, and the details around it are a bit vague. As far as I can gather, it was made by someone who secretly recorded Roy while pretending to be making a documentary that would be sympathetic to him. Even though Mississippi is a one-party consent state, meaning the recording was legal, it may have been deemed unethical to release because the interview took place under false pretenses. It's also possible that Roy never signed a release as the interview was conducted as part of a documentary, just not the kind Roy thought it was going to be. Regardless, according to people who heard the tape, Roy went on a tour of all the sites in money related to Emmett's murder, smiling and laughing as he talked about his brutal torture of a child. You f***ing psycho. He also alluded to the fact that there were indeed other people responsible for Emmett's murder besides him and John, though he refused to say who. He is reported to have said, "I'm the only one living that knows, and that's all that will ever be known." Well, what about the other people who were involved? Surely they know as well, or they're all dead, right? Since nobody had ever faced justice for Emmett's murder, in 2004 the Department of Justice decided to reopen the case. The first step was to exhume his body, and DNA testing confirmed what was already known, that the body found in the Tallahatchie River was in fact Emmett's. Evidence was collected, and in 2007 charges of manslaughter were brought against Carolyn. The grand jury just declined to indict her. That could have been the end of it, but in 2008, Carolyn agreed to an interview with writer and historian Timothy Tyson. Holy shit, this is so many years later. This led to the 2017 book, The Blood of Emmett Till, in which he claimed that Carolyn retracted her testimony while speaking with him. He quoted Carolyn as saying, "That part's not true, with regards to everything that happened inside the store when she and Emmett were alone." However, Carolyn and her daughter-in-law, Marcia, who were there for the interviews, both contended that Carolyn never said such a thing. Timothy had audio recordings of his interviews with Carolyn, but that statement didn't appear anywhere in them. Okay. Well, it seems like she didn't say that then. At various times, Timothy claimed either the recorder wasn't working at the time, that the tape was lost, or that he hadn't started recording yet, but he also claimed this happened in June of 2008, which according to his emails was before he and Carolyn met in person for the first time. This doesn't seem very, substantive. While the alleged retraction of a confession can't be substantiated, and almost certainly didn't happen, something else interesting did come of this. Prior to meeting with Timothy, Carolyn had written her own memoir, which she dictated to Marcia. She gave a copy of this memoir to Timothy on the condition that it not be released until after her death. Timothy agreed, and he brought the memoir back to the University of North Carolina, where he was an adjunct professor. It was placed in the archives of the university's Southern Historical Collection with orders for it not to be released until 2036. You're just making a guess on when she's going to die. When Timothy released his book in 2017, it made headlines nationwide, but the excitement that someone might be brought to justice quickly fizzled out once it was discovered that he was probably lying and Carolyn never retracted her testimony. This really aren't you supposed to be a journalist of some variety? Writer and historian. Historian should be more focused on the facts, right? Not the salaciousness of things. Investigations into the case and any living co-conspirators continued, however, and in July of 2022, a discovery was made. I mentioned before that LaFleur had issued warrants for Roy, John, and Carolyn for kidnapping Emmett, but nobody actually knew that yet. It wasn't until 2022 that the unserved warrant for Carolyn's arrest was discovered in the basement of the LaFleur County Courthouse. Emmett's family called for Carolyn's arrest, but the DA declined to do so, citing a lack of new evidence. So, Timothy did what any respected journalist would do in that situation. He broke his promise to Carolyn and leaked the memoir to a news conglomerate. Dude, Timothy, come on, dude. You can do better. You should be doing better than this. The memoir was, to put it simply, horrible. It was titled, I Am More Than a Wolf Whistle, and it detailed Carolyn's harrowing life as a perpetual victim. There was no remorse for Emmett anywhere in the book's 99 pages, and it was all a bunch of whiny bullshit about how she was the real victim that day because her life changed forever afterwards. Boo fucking who, Caroline? Boo fucking who? However, Carolyn's memoir did not include her account of what took place when she met Emmett on the night that he was killed. Her story was filled with inconsistencies with her official testimony, or I guess unofficial since the testimony was inadmissible, which raised an important question. Was she lying then? Was she lying now? Or were both stories lies? I imagine it's kind of all a bunch of half-cooked things shoved together, partial inaccuracies, all a real mess. Much like the article in Look magazine, it's unlikely that Carolyn's memoir was particularly accurate. Readers noted that it conjured the Black Beast rapist mythology in describing Emmett, and the book was just dripping with racism. Oh, colour me shocked right there. The entire thing was one final attempt for Carolyn to absolve herself in the public's eyes by making herself the victim, and it fully backfired. Between her total lack of remorse, overt racism, and blatant contradictions to her previously established facts and her own prior testimony, there was an immediate outcry for Carolyn to be arrested and charged with Emmett's murder. Good. We're living in a different time now. This is like the 21st century.
Excuse me?
But that didn't happen. The case was brought before a grand jury in August of 2022, but they believed there was insufficient evidence to indict Carolyn, which honestly, kind of wild. There's an old saying that a grand jury will indict a ham sandwich, and you'd think that 7 hours of testimony from investigators and witnesses would be enough for an indictment. Grand juries in the US are basically a rubber stamp, with them voting to indict in 99.993% of cases. In that case, why even bother with them? It just seems like a big waste of everyone's time. Following the jury's decision, Reverend Wheeler Parker, Emmett's cousin and the last living witness to his abduction, said, "The prosecutor tried his best, and we appreciate his efforts, but he alone cannot undo hundreds of years of anti-black systems that guaranteed those who killed Emmett Till would go unpunished to this day." Yeah, I mean, obviously not. He obviously couldn't, and that is insane. No words. Less than a year later, in April of 2023, Carolyn died at the age of 88. Since she, Roy, and John all died while refusing to name any of the other people involved, it seems that Wheeler's assessment was correct, and none of the people responsible for Emmett's death will ever see justice. The one silver lining is that if the other co-conspirators aren't already dead and burning in hell, well, they will be soon. Yeah, where they belong. Alright, well, that was depressing, and let's move on to another depressing one. The Central Park 5. Isn't this the one that has something to do with Trump? Wasn't Trump somehow not involved in the crime in this, but there was Wasn't there something to do with an advert or something? I might be getting that completely wrong, so I apologize if I am.
I would like to buy a hamburger.
I would like to buy a hamburger!
For nearly 2 centuries, New York City was synonymous with crime. There were a lot of different reasons for why this is the case, but for the majority of that time, it was the combination of organized criminal enterprises and police and government corruption that allowed crime to flourish in the city. The rates of crime throughout the city continued to increase until they finally peaked in the late 1980s and early 1990s during the crack epidemic. In 1988, New York City set a new record of 1,896 murders in the city, and it was well known that Central Park was a dangerous place. I just don't imagine Central Park as dangerous. It's like a park in the city, in the middle of a big city. I guess it does seem, that seems quite dangerous. Anyway, no, I understand now. If you went during daylight hours and stuck to the heavily trafficked areas, things would be fine. But entering the park at night meant taking your life into your own hands. Assaults, muggings, and other violent crimes were common, and they had been for quite a while at that point. When it was first built in the 1800s, Central Park was a nice place. It then went through a significant decline, followed by a reconstruction under City Park Commissioner Robert Moses, who held the position from 1934 until 1960. After Moses left the role, there was a revolving cast of short-lived and ineffective commissioners who let the park fall into disrepair again. This was only made worse in 1975, when New York City had faced a financial crisis. Much of the park became overgrown, and most of the lights had become broken and destroyed. The city simply didn't have the money to spare on anything as frivolous as a park, so the dark, wooded areas became a hub for violent crime. A non-profit organization was created in 1980 to bring in private money to refurbish the park, and that group was so successful that as of 1998, they took over management of the park from the city entirely. Wow. I mean, the city's probably happy because they're like, well, we're not paying for it. That's kind of a bad precedent, doesn't it? Of like, if we don't take care of our parks, eventually a charity's going to come along and do it for us. So let's just not take care of the parks.
Problem solved.
That all took time, though, and back in 1989, things were still really bad. On the 19th of April, 1989, 28-year-old investment banker Tricia Maley went for an evening jog through the park. I realize that everything I just said probably makes that sound like a dangerous proposition. Indeed it does, but she was unconcerned. She had excelled at everything she'd done in her life thus far, achieving 2 master's degrees from Yale and getting on the fast track at Salomon Brothers, which at the time was one of the largest financial firms in New York City. You are on the up and up and probably making a lot of money for a 28-year-old. Her youth, combined with her success, made Tricia feel invincible. It didn't help that her friends warned her about how dangerous the park could be at night. She was the type of person to interpret that warning as a challenge, jogging fearlessly through the park. Yes, she is 28. It's kind of, I feel, I don't know, me at 28 probably would have felt the same way. Now I'm like, no, don't take any risks. Although she usually stuck to the main paths, sometimes she would change up her route and veer into more isolated areas, though she did try to do this at the beginning of her runs before it got too late. It was the solitary concession she made in deference to the concern of her friends. But that night, the jog didn't go as she had planned. Tricia was struck in the head hard with a large branch while she was jogging near the 102nd Street crossing, then dragged about 300 feet off the path. Once her attacker, or attackers, had taken her somewhere secluded, they violently beat her to within an inch of her life. Why? Why? There were multiple fractures to Tricia's skull. One of her eyes was dislodged from its socket, which in turn had 25 fractures, and there were numerous cuts on her face. Tricia was then gagged before being sexually assaulted and left for dead. Why? What the fuck? It wasn't until about 1:30 a.m. that the next morning that passers-by finally stumbled onto Tricia's body. She was naked, bound, and covered in blood and mud. She was comatose, hypothermic, and had lost 75 to 80% of her blood. I wouldn't have thought it was possible to survive losing that much blood, and when she was rushed to the hospital, the doctors largely agreed. After she was admitted to the hospital, it was assumed that Tricia was either going to die from her wounds or stay in a coma forever. If she woke up, she'd presumably be permanently disabled and mentally impaired. Much to everyone's surprise, she woke up 12 days after being admitted to the hospital. But by then, the suspects had long been in custody. Wow, okay, how's she doing after that? Tricia hadn't been the only person attacked that night in Central Park. She'd just gotten the worst of it. There were a number of other assaults and muggings, and numerous calls came into the police between 9 and 10 p.m. or so. Around 10:15, police arrested Raymond Santana and Kevin Richardson, both 14, for unlawful assembly. What's unlawful assembly? Is that just going a place where you're not supposed to be? Being a little bit naughty?
Albeit unlawful ones.
They had been part of a group of around 30 or so kids from Harlem, all black or Latino, had entered the park that night. Some scattered, but Raymond and Kevin were arrested along with many others who never got dragged into the case. Even though they were being held on unrelated charges, once Trisha's body was discovered, Raymond and Kevin were immediately connected to her assault. Okay. Over the course of their interrogations, they implicated two of their friends, Anton McCrae and Yusuf Salam, who were both 15. Both were brought in for questioning, with Yusuf being accompanied by his 16-year-old friend Corey Wise. But since Corey had come to the station, the police figured that they might as well interrogate him too. It's like, oh, you're here. Get in the chair. Let's interrogate you. Why not, mate? Well, where's the t-shirt? I want to talk to my lawyer. Get the t-shirt. Lawyer, lawyer, lawyer. Oh, God.
Oh, look, it's Jeff Winger Fun Police.
What followed was a horrible interrogation conducted by horrible people. It's an unfortunate state of affairs, but in the United States, the police are allowed to lie to people being interrogated, or just in general. I was actually curious, so I looked it up, and as far as I can tell, this is predominantly an American thing. Yeah, I'm pretty sure the police can't lie to you in the UK. I think we covered that in a previous episode. They can't say, we know you did it, we've got evidence, in the hope that you'll admit it. They can't do that. I think. Doesn't matter, get a lawyer, the lawyer will know. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Simon, but it looks like it's straight up illegal for British police to lie about having evidence that they don't have, or about the strength of evidence that they do have. Yeah, exactly. They also can't lie about offers of leniency in exchange for a confession when no genuine offer exists. Some other countries seem to allow a very small bending of the truth, but nothing like in the US, where the police can lie to you about having eyewitnesses, fingerprints, DNA, and a signed letter from your mum proving that you're guilty. These were the sorts of tactics used by police in interrogating the five boys that became known as the Central Park Five. Of course, in reality, the police had none of that. They did have semen samples from Trisha's cervix and her socks, but the DNA did not match any of the suspects. All the police had done was round up the first 5 non-white kids that they could find and decided that they were the ones responsible for Trisha's assault based on, well, literally nothing. Yeah, it's like, what have you got? Literally proximity in Central Park, which is very large. That's it. In addition to the police blatantly lying to the suspects, the interrogations all took place in isolation without a lawyer or legal guardian present. How can that be allowed? They're 15 and 14. How's that allowed? How's that even a thing? Corey didn't have a right to have a parent present since he was 16. Oh, okay. But all the others did. But 16's not 18. Okay. It's reported that only one of the kids had a parent present for any of the interrogation, but I can't find out which one of the 5 that was referring to. It's possible it was referring to Yusuf, who had actually lied to the police and said he was 16 rather than 15. He even had a fake ID to prove that he was 16, which is kind of weird. Oh, okay. Before 1988, the minimum age to buy cigarettes in New York was 16, but in 1988 it was changed to 18. You know what's weird? You could buy cigarettes at 16 when I was 16. Could you? Maybe it was just before. Around the time, I didn't smoke, but around the time that I was turning that age or around that age, they changed it to 18. It was really bizarre that you could buy cigarettes as a 16-year-old.
How old are you? Old enough.
If the law had an exception, where people who were already 15 when it passed would still be allowed to buy cigarettes at 16 instead of 18, then I guess that could explain the fake ID. But otherwise, I'm not sure why someone in 1989 would want a fake ID pretending to be 16. I'm getting a little off track, though, because the police had reason to believe that Yusuf was 16. They wouldn't have needed a parent present to interrogate him anyway. But his mother found out he was at the station, so she went down and demanded a lawyer. Excellent move. At that point, the interrogation stopped, and Yusuf never recorded a confession. Excellent. I'm assuming that I'm running with the fact that none of these guys are guilty because this is an episode about miscarriages of justice. So I'm saying it's excellent that he didn't confess. The police did write up a confession based on Yusuf's statements, but he refused to sign it. Good man. Good lawyer. However, he was the only holdout in terms of creating a legally admissible confession. The other 4 boys all gave videotaped confessions in the presence of their parents, save for Corey since he was 16, though the police only called the parents in to witness the confessions rather than the interrogation process. That's insane. Lawyer, lawyer, lawyer. So other than being lied to about non-existent violence, what else happened to the Central Park Five during their interrogations? Well, we can't say for sure because none of the interrogations were videotaped, only the confessions were. Each boy was interrogated for at least 7 hours, and there's no record of any of it. Not only is there no record of the tactics the police used, there's no record of whether or not the boys asked for their parents or lawyers. But those hours of interrogations were not continuous, and there was a lot of waiting. They claimed to have been held in custody for over 24 hours, and that they were denied food, water, and sleep the entire time. Yusuf also stated, I would hear them beating up Corey Wise in the next room. They would come and look at me and say, you realize you're next. If their statements are accurate, that is absolutely appalling. And if they're not accurate, well, there's no way for us to know because the police didn't record the interrogations. How is that allowed? Why would that not be being recorded? It seems enormously important. After hours of threats and lies, the police finally convinced all 5 to confess. Sort of, anyway. None of them confessed to sexually assaulting Tricia, just that they'd held her down while others assaulted her. That would still very much be a crime, but their stories also didn't line up. All 5 suspects claimed that different people were involved in the assault, and parts of their stories were directly contradicted by the actual facts of the case. For example, Corey's confession mentioned someone stabbing Tricia, but she was never stabbed. She was initially hit in the head with a branch, then her face was beaten with a rock when she tried to fight back. That glaring departure from reality should also have been a major red flag to the interrogators and the eventual prosecution, but they all just rolled with it. Getting railroaded, are we, boys? Of course, the fact that they all named different people as being involved in the assault is a big part of how police got confessions in the first place. The suspects mostly knew who one another were, but they weren't all close friends or anything like that. So once police told each of the kids that someone else they barely knew had put all the blame on them, their response was essentially, "F*** you, I'm just going to say that they did it." Which seems fine in your head, but a lawyer would not, they'd sort this out. Once the police were done obtaining confessions through unsavory methods, the next step was to make sure the entire world knew about the arrests. The media was immediately all over the case, using the most inflammatory rhetoric possible, and much of this centered around the term wilding, used in a police press conference the same day that the confessions were recorded. What is wilding, you ask? I know this from... Isn't it Stephen King's book, Dallas 63, where at the end, oh God, I'm going to spoil it and everything.
Cover your ears.
I'm not going to spoil it, because it's such an incredible book you should read. But this term is used in there for kids running wild. And what is wilding, you ask? Well, nothing. It's not a thing. Oh, okay. And certainly it's not something that any of the boys said during their confession. There are a couple of proposed origins for where this term came from, one of which makes more sense than the other. One possible explanation is that the police heard some of the boys they arrested singing the 1989 hit single Wild Thing by Tone Loc while they were in their holding cells, and that the police misheard or misrepresented it. While I would love for that to be true, as it would be a fun illustration of the ineptitude of the police, it's extremely unlikely. As one of the Central Park Five explained years later, Tone Loc was a West Coast rapper, so no kids in New York City were going to be singing his songs. Personally, I prefer Tone Loc's original draft of that song when it was still called Crazy Stuff anyway. I have no idea what any of this is. A more likely explanation was that wilding was the police's misinterpretation and bastardization of willing or willing out. It's a phrase that basically means being crazy and out of control, though it typically did not have violent connotations. It essentially meant that they were acting like dumbass teenagers, which makes sense since that's exactly what they were. Of course, it's also possible that the police made up the word wilding wholesale because they thought the public would find the word evocative. And if that was the goal, it worked. The term wilding evoked images of wild animals hunting their prey, and that was how the suspects were immediately portrayed. The day after the press conference, the New York Daily News ran an article with the headline, "Wolf Packs Prey," in reference to Tricia's assault. The next day, the New York Post ran an article containing the following passage. Long quote here. "They were coming downtown from a world of crack, welfare, guns, knives, indifference, and ignorance. They were coming from a land of no fathers. They were coming from the anarchic province of the poor, and driven by a collective fury, brimming with all the rippling energies of youth, their minds teeming with the violent images of the streets and movies. They had only one goal, to smash, hurt, rob, stomp. The enemies were rich. The enemies were white." The New York Post is a bit of a trashy paper, right? But this is some next-level trash right there. Now, I know the Post is regarded mostly as a conservative tabloid, but that still is some pretty profoundly racist bullshit, isn't it? And as a reminder, Simon, because I know you're frequently confounded when trying to understand the severe racial tensions in modern-day America, this was printed multiple years after you and I were born. Yeah, it's pretty shocking, isn't it? As a fun side note about racism in America... Kevin's put fun in quotations there. There was a similar attack to Tricia's just a few weeks later. This one in Brooklyn, not Central Park, but a 39-year-old woman was sexually assaulted by 2 men and then thrown off a 4-story building. She luckily survived, though she needed extensive medical treatment and physical rehabilitation. But this victim was black, So the story received almost no media attention. Back to the media coverage of Central Park 5 though, and it was clear that the media's goal was to portray the suspects as subhuman animals, dangerous beasts that should be feared, for they could not be tamed. The only way to deal with that kind of person was to either avoid them or lock them in cages. That's how most people in the media saw it anyway, though one man saw a third option. Oh, here he is! On May the 1st, Donald Trump paid $85,000, that's about $220,000 today, to take out a full-page ad in New York's 4 major daily newspapers, The Times, Post, Daily News, and Newsday. The ad was an open letter to the city of New York, with the title of the letter taking the top half of the page in a giant font. Bring back the death penalty, bring back our police. Although Trump didn't mention the Central Park 5 by name, referring only to unmanned, roving bands of wild criminals, the implication was clear. He was publicly advocating for these 5 teenagers to be executed, even though they had not yet gone to trial. He wrote in the ad, Mayor Carter stated that hate and rancor should be removed from our hearts. I do not think so. I want to hate these muggers and murderers. They should be forced to suffer. This is fairly intense stuff, isn't it? To be fair, I do agree that murderers should be forced to suffer, but murder is very different than mugging, which we'll get back to later. Regardless, there was a massive public backlash to this advertisement, prompting Trump to talk to Larry King on CNC. True to his form, he proved himself to be disconnected with reality and angry about fake news, though he didn't use that term. It probably hadn't been invented yet, had it? What was it called in the past? Like yellow journalism? Historically? When Larry King asked if the ad was insightful or prejudging the suspects, Trump defended his statements. He went on to claim that 95% of the public agreed with him, though only 40% of journalists did, and that the media was portraying it unfairly. The source for those statistics was, of course, the deepest annals of Trump's posterior. But even if the general public wasn't thrilled about the prospect of calling for the execution of teenagers who hadn't even gone to trial yet, they were still convinced that the 5 kids were guilty. This just left the trials. Leading up to the trial, Yusuf and Kevin had made bail, but Anton and Raymond had not, so they were being held in juvie. Corey was unable to make bail, but since he was 16 years old, he was sent to Rikers Island to await trial. All 5 were being charged for the assault, sexual assault, and attempted murder of Trisha, as well as being charged with another assault in the park. They were split into 2 trials, with Anton, Yusuf, and Raymond going to court starting in June, and Corey and Kevin going to trial in October. Each trial lasted about 2 months, with similarly predictable results. After all, the police had collected a mountain of evidence during the intervening months. Right? Well, no, not at all, actually. There was DNA evidence, but the DNA found at the scene was ruled inconclusive by the police, despite definitely not belonging to any of the suspects. Well, that seems pretty conclusive when you use the word definitively there. Sorry, not definitely, definitively. It's definitive. There were a couple of hairs found on one of the suspects that was consistent with Trisha's hair. That doesn't mean they were a definite match in any way, just that they were, kind of similar. Also, that sort of visual hair analysis is now considered pseudoscientific anyway, though it was considered reliable at the time. Oh yes, and Kevin had a couple of scratches on his face that could theoretically have been from Trisha trying to defend herself. Well, then look under her fingernails for his skin and run the DNA. Or they could have been from literally anything else, because it's not like his skin cells were found under her fingernails or anything. Well, they did do that, and they didn't find anything useful, so it's not from her. There were also eyewitness accounts that the boys were in the park. No one saw them assault Trisha, but they were definitely in the park. Well, yeah, that's like I said, the only thing they have is proximity. That's literally it. So yes, the prosecution had basically no meaningful evidence. All they had were the boys' confessions that they had all recanted as coerced shortly after they were given. And even though Yusuf never signed his confession, the judge ruled it to be admissible anyway, which is f***ing insane. That is f***ing insane. How is that even legal? There was no recording of his interrogation, and he had not made a videotaped confession like the others had, yet the document, written up by the police, that Yusuf refused to sign was somehow considered admissible as confession. I don't possibly understand how that is even real. I genuinely can't get over how profoundly fucked up that is. Yeah, Kevin, me and you on the same page on that one. It's worth noting that judges in New York are normally assigned to cases randomly by a lottery system. But for this case, a specific judge was chosen and assigned to the case. The judge had a reputation for being biased towards the prosecution and giving out overly harsh sentences, but the defense's attempts to remove him and get a new judge were unsuccessful. It'd be fine if you had this judge if it was through the lottery system. But by him being specifically assigned, that reeks of railroading these kids into prison, or worse. Beyond the confessions, there was only one other piece of evidence, so to speak. Against the advice of her doctors and lawyers, Tricia insisted on testifying in court. This was a somewhat bizarre decision because she had nothing material to offer. Although she eventually recovered physically and began jogging again a few months after being released from the hospital, holy shit, that's really impressive. She struggled to walk in the courtroom. More importantly, the damage to her brain had left her with no memory of the assault or the hour leading up to it. She still struggles with some memory and vision issues to this day, though she has otherwise recovered. Excellent. But the point is, she couldn't identify her attacker or attackers because she had no memory of the assault. Tricia's presence at the trial really only served two purposes. One was to prejudice the jury against the defendants by showing how hard it was for her to walk now, and the other was to remind everyone why victims of sexual assault often refuse to report their crimes. Protesters at the courthouse yelled at Tricia, calling her and a whore. Are you fucking kidding me? What is going on with... This is just... What? Which is beyond insane. Yes, it is, Kevin. If there were people protesting the trial because they felt the defendants were being unjustly railroaded by the police and the prosecution, that's fine. Yeah, there should be people protesting that. It's absolutely your right to protest, but there's no reason to yell like that to the person who was very clearly the victim of a sexual assault. That is insane. Get your shit together, whoever's shouting this. Unfortunately, the defense only had one strategy, which was to attack the veracity of the confessions. This might have worked if the trial took place decades later, as DNA has exonerated so many wrongfully convicted people that we now have a better understanding of how and why false confession happens. But back in 1989, in an extremely emotionally charged trial, that wasn't going to be enough to convince a jury. Of course, the Central Park Five did have an alibi for the time of Tricia's assault, but their attorneys chose not to use it in court. The suspects couldn't have been guilty because when Tricia was attacked, they were in a different part of the park, nearly a kilometre away, committing other crimes. I can understand why a defense attorney might not want to go that route, but as we always say here, it's okay to confess to less severe crimes to get out of worse crimes. Yes, and if you've done the worst crime and then admit to a lesser crime, the police know what you're up to. They're going to still think you did the major crime, and then they're going to be like, and you also did this other crime. So only do it. Just get a lawyer. Just get a lawyer, right? They'll tell you what to do. For many people, though, this alibi creates a bit of a moral grey area. These weren't innocent kids being unjustly accused. They were still criminals. So in the eyes of many, it didn't matter if they were guilty of what they'd been accused of because they were obviously still guilty of something. To those people, any conviction would be fair because these kids had it coming. These are really different crimes, my guy. While I can understand that sentiment, it's not really accurate. As I alluded to before, there is a big difference between punching someone and stealing their wallet and sexually assaulting someone and leaving them for dead with only about 20% of their blood left in their body. Those are vastly different crimes with different punishments. And you can't convict a person of whatever they happen to be accused of without evidence just because you're confident they did something else bad anyway. Despite an FBI expert testifying that the DNA samples found in and on Tricia were conclusively not from any of the accused, all 5 were found guilty. Just a reminder, one of the bits of evidence against one of these kids was a confession that the police wrote and he never signed. This is beyond miscarriage of justice. This is insanity. In the first trial, Anton, Yusuf and Raymond, Yusuf was the guy, with the confession he didn't sign, were convicted of assault and sexual assault, though they were acquitted of attempted murder. Because they were juveniles, each was given the maximum penalty of 5 to 10 years in juvie. At the second trial, Corey was acquitted of both attempted murder and sexual assault. They were still found guilty of assault, sexual abuse and rioting. Kevin was found guilty of sexual assault and sodomy, and was the only one of the 5 to be convicted of attempted murder. He also received 5 to 10 years in juvie, since he was a minor, but since he was 16 years old, Corey received 5 to 15 years at Rikers Island. And I think we've covered Rikers Island before. Not a very nice place to go. As for how the 5 took their convictions at trial, it ranged from stoic righteousness to pure anger. Yusuf replied to his conviction by saying, "I look upon this legal lynching as a test by my God, Allah." He went on to request that the judge give him the maximum sentence, as sooner or later the truth will come out. Corey, on the other hand, responded by shouting at the prosecutor, "You're going to pay for this. Jesus is going to get you. You made this up." It didn't take long for the convictions to become the subject of criticism. Not only had Tricia been the victim of an incredible brutality, barely surviving, but her assault was a symptom of everything that was wrong with the city of New York, particularly the steadily rising rate of violent crime. Some in the media argued that the verdicts weren't even about the case itself, instead being seen as a battle for the soul of New York and a possible solution to the problems that have been plaguing the city. Solution to the problems plaguing the city. Locking up innocent people. What the f***? There was also the matter of Trump's advertisements and CNN appearance, which many believe poisoned the well of jurors. Regardless of whether people agreed with this proposal to bring back the death penalty, the inflammatory rhetoric and presumption of guilt became part of the narrative surrounding the case. With months passing between the ad being published and the first trial beginning, there was no way to know they were going to go and find jurors who hadn't been influenced by this rhetoric. Even the criticism of the case may have been influenced by this rhetoric to a degree. There were journalists and others arguing that the case was weak, lacked evidence, and the confessions were clearly coerced and unreliable, but nobody was really arguing that the boys were innocent. The argument was basically, this was a terrible case and never should have resulted in a conviction, but we should probably leave them in prison and just do better in the future. That is f***ed up. That is so extremely f***ed up. Anton, Raymond, Kevin, and Yusuf each spent 6 to 7 years in juvie before being paroled between 1995 and 1997. During their incarceration, Kevin, Raymond, and Yusuf each earned their GED, as well as an associate's degree. I started reading that sentence with outrage, assuming it was going to be something bad, but they actually made good use of their time inside. I don't know what juvie's like. It's like prison for children, right? But Corey had the worst of it. He had to go to Rikers Island. While the others were in juvie, Corey had to go to federal. This is Kevin's words, not mine. Federal pounds me in the arse prison.
No! God, please, no! No!
Things weren't quite as bad as they would have been had the victim been a child, but inmates don't take kindly to rapists either, though they don't seem to have much issue with non-sexual violence against women. Well, I imagine a lot of them are in there for violence against women or non-sexual as well. What's the coolest thing to be in prison for? I feel like it's got to be extreme, bank robbery. It's got to be about money, right? Because then it's like, oh, you're just hurting the government. You're hurting an insurance company. Fine. But robbery? Maybe some sort of massive fraud, like Bernie Madoff style. But then he stole everyone's pensions, which people weren't happy about. Is murder called in prison? Probably not. I don't know. Murder's kind of scary. Whereas robbery, dude, being a jewel thief, art robber, that's it. Pink Panther style.
I would like to take a closer look at your bulls.
My what?
Corey was repeatedly assaulted and sexually assaulted by the guards and prisoners alike. Much of his time in prison would be spent in solitary confinement, something he requested as a way to protect himself from the assaults. He also requested prison transfers multiple times in the hopes that he would face less violence in the next prison. In 1989, shortly after his conviction, Corey had a bit of an incident in the TV room at Rikers Island with another inmate by the name of Matthias Reyes. There was some sort of argument over the TV that almost turned into a fight, though the two never actually came to blows with one another. Wait, what? That doesn't sound like bad at all. You'd be like, I'm watching that! In terms of prison violence, I don't think that even qualifies as violence. Fast forward to 2002, and Corey again... Oh, okay, this story isn't over. He again ran into Matthias, this time at the Auburn Correctional Facility. Matthias apologized for the incident from over a decade earlier, and they had a friendly conversation. But there was something different about their encounter this time, and not just that it was friendly in nature, rather than aggressive. Okay, I wonder where we're going. When the two had first crossed paths, Matthias was at Rikers awaiting trial. He was accused of being the East Side slasher, a murderer and serial rapist who had been terrorizing New York City, but since he was awaiting trial, there was a chance that he might weasel his way out of the accusations. That was not the case, though, and in 1991, Matthias confessed and pled guilty to 5 counts of sexual assault, 2 counts of attempted sexual assault, and 1 murder. So by the time Matthias and Corey ran into each other again in 2002, Matthias was serving a sentence of 33 years to life in prison. Unlike in 1989, when he had an incentive to keep his mouth shut and not draw attention to crimes he wasn't already being investigated for, but now he had no longer anything left to lose. Oh my lord, is he the person who actually did the crime in the park? And Corey seemed like a nice enough guy. So Matthias felt bad that this innocent man had spent the past 13 years in prison for one of his crimes. Or is he going to just confess even though he's not the guy? Deciding to finally do the right thing, Matthias contacted the Manhattan DA's office to confess to Trisha's assault. Even though the case had already gone to trial, there was still information the police held back that only would have been known to the killer. Oh my god, it's actually him. Matthias provided a step-by-step account of how he assaulted Trisha. He'd hit her with a branch, dragged her somewhere secluded, and attempted to sexually assault her. When she recovered from the initial blow to the head and attempted to fight back, he began beating her with a rock to subdue her. He then told her, "Your eyes or your life," which explains why one of her eyes was dislodged when her body was found. Bro, that is... what the f*** is wrong with you, Matthias? You f***ing psycho. Who says something like that? This was similar to a threat he made during another assault in which he sexually assaulted a woman in her home and told her, "Your eyes or your kids." What are you doing? That threat was overheard and reported by one of her children. Unlike with the supposed confessions of the Central Park Five, everything Matthias said matched what the police knew, and his DNA was a conclusive match with the semen found at the scene. Somewhat frustratingly, Matthias was actually in custody shortly after the attack against Trisha for another sexual assault he committed in Central Park just 2 days earlier. However, police didn't connect the two cases at the time. I mean, why would they? 2 sexual assaults occurring in the same place with similar MOs. Police, get your shit together. Fucking incompetent pieces of shit, in my opinion. Matthias had been assaulting a woman in the park, but he ran away once witnesses caught him in the act. That crime was being investigated as a sexual assault, while the attack against Trisha was being investigated as an attempted homicide. Right, but you also know there was sexual assault, don't ya? Since there were 2 unrelated teams working on the 2 cases, I guess they never talked to one another despite the obvious similarities between the cases. As a result, they didn't specifically test Matthias' DNA against the DNA in Trisha's case. Nowadays, law enforcement has registries of DNA, so stuff like this doesn't get overlooked. But New York didn't create its registry until 1994. Following Matthias' confession, the Central Park Five filed motions to have their convictions vacated. This motion was supported by the DA's office, so in 2002, the Central Park Five became known as the Exonerated Five, and Corey was finally released from prison after 13 years of assaults and solitary confinement. I hope that you sue the out of these people. In fact, YouTube has numerous video essays and documentaries explaining that the Central Park Five were actually guilty. Probably more than there are telling the truth about the case. Why? What the f***? Though both are wildly outnumbered by interviews with the men themselves, explaining they're actually guilty. Bro, they caught the guy with the forensic evidence and the confession came forward and admitted to it. That trumps a confession, doesn't it? Especially a forced confession. In total, these men spent a combined 40 years in prison for a crime they didn't commit, and even after the real perpetrator of Trisha's assault confessed and proved his own guilt, a meaningful percentage of the public still views them as murderers and rapists. It just goes to show that even once a person who was wrongly accused or convicted has been exonerated, that stigma continues to follow them for the rest of their lives. At least they got that sweet settlement money, though. Did they? What's up, ChatGPT? Yo, I need to know. The Central Park Five, right? They were just... they got exonerated because it turns out they weren't guilty at all, right?
Yeah, you've got it right. The Central Park Five were indeed exonerated.
Okay, cool. How much money did they get in the end? How much money did the government or whoever they sued give them? Just give me the numbers real quick.
Absolutely. So in the end, the Central Park Five settled with New York City for about $41 million in total.
Yeah, boy! They got the bag, yes! Woo, that's good result. I mean, they spent 40 years in prison, so f*** that. But 40 years, 40 million, boom. Did that guy who spent 13 years in prison get 13 million? $13 million is set for life money. Henry McCollum and Leon Brown. The year was 1983, and like so many adults and children alike at the time, 11-year-old Sabrina Bui was absolutely riddled with Pac-Man fever. Sabrina left her home in Red Springs, North Carolina, on September the 23rd, and according to the early reporting, she'd left to go and visit a local arcade. Note that this wasn't an arcade in the sense that you're probably thinking. It was a room attached to a small convenience store that probably just had 2 or 3 arcade cabinets. It's not a terribly important distinction, other than this wasn't some huge place full of potential witnesses who could verify whether or not Sabrina actually made it to the arcade. Regardless, Sabrina never returned home from her trip. 2 days later, on the 25th, her father reported her missing. 2 days later, she's 11, dude. If my kid... didn't, like, if they were missing for like a couple of hours, I'd be like, please, please, please. And they'd be like, you have to wait. And I'd be like, no, get on it. And no, I don't know why he waited so long to contact the police unless he was operating under the false assumption that she'd be gone for 24 hours before she could be reported missing. Oh yeah, that's that common, like, misconception, which is a misconception. You can report people missing like right away. Probably recommended in a case like this, yes? The following day, after nearly 2 full days of searching, Sabrina's body was found. She'd been discovered in the underbrush near a soybean field behind the convenience store, completely naked except for a bra that had been pushed up around her neck. The evidence indicated she's 11, by the way, just a little reminder there, that she'd been sexually assaulted, then suffocated to death with her own underwear, that had been forced down her throat with a stick. In addition to Sabrina's bloody clothes and bloody stick, police found evidence including beer cans and cigarette butts. Based on the location of the physical evidence, it was believed that Sabrina was assaulted and killed in the soybean field before the killer hid her body in the underbrush. Jesus Christ. Police began interviewing people in the area, particularly kids and teens who might have known Sabrina, hoping to find any information about what happened and construct some sort of timeline. Among those interviewed was 19-year-old Henry McCollum, who had only recently come to town. This is a dark episode of this entry. Henry and his 15-year-old half-brother, Leon Brown, had both been in Jersey City, New Jersey. Their mother, Mammy Brown, relocated to Red Springs, so the boys were raised by their grandmother in the New Jersey projects. They had come to Red Springs a few weeks earlier to stay with their mother, though it's unclear whether they were just visiting or permanently staying with her now. When Henry was first interviewed, he said that he'd last seen Sabrina walking to the store, but that he didn't know about what had happened. There was nothing incriminating in his statements and no evidence suggesting he knew more than he was telling the police, so he was let go. Unfortunately, Red Springs was a small town of about 3,600 people, and the police seemed particularly interested in soliciting information and tips that would implicate people from out of town. That doesn't sound like a great way to conduct an investigation. No, it doesn't. Let's start with people who don't live here.
You from out of town?
But I guess nobody wanted to believe that there'd been a child killer living among them in their small community. 3,600 people, though. It's a very small community, but it's also a lot of people. One of them could be a f***ing psycho, sick weirdo, right? There was also the issue that Henry and Leon were both severely mentally disabled. Henry's IQ was tested as being in the 50s, maybe as high as 60, while Leon's IQ was measured at 49. That's, below functional. You can't function by yourself with an IQ like that, can you? Basically, however much above average intelligence Albert Einstein was, these boys were that far below average intelligence. Were they? Like, they're 50 below. Einstein's IQ must have been more than 150, no? If we ignore the specific numbers because IQ tests are flawed, there was no dispute that they were both mentally disabled, with Leon being more severely affected. And in the 1980s, that made them prime targets for ridicule and nasty rumors from other kids and teenagers. I don't know if that's actually changed these days, but we definitely were all arseholes as kids back in the 80s. Yeah, could also confirm, Kevin's a little bit older than me, we were also arseholes in the 90s. Among those arseholes was a 17-year-old high school kid named Ethel. When talking to the police, Ethel implicated Henry in Sabrina's murder, citing a bunch of rumors that had started simply because the neurotypical kids thought that Henry acted weird. Not only did she implicate Henry in Sabrina's death, she also claimed that he had robbed a pimp and been the culprit of an attempted sexual assault that took place in the town the previous year. How could Henry have committed the attempted sexual assault in Red Springs when he was still living in Jersey City, you ask? Shut up, that's how. Based on these completely unsubstantiated rumors, the police went to Mammy's house and brought Henry down to the station for questioning. There are no records of interrogations, as the law didn't yet require them, so everything we know came from a combination of police records and testimony made under oath by those being interrogated. That started with Henry being told that a witness had placed him at the scene of the crime, which was already a lie. Ethel hadn't witnessed anything, she was just repeating schoolyard rumors. Regardless, police were convinced of Henry's guilt, so they absolutely laid into him trying to get a confession. Even though Henry kept denying his guilt, the police kept aggressively interrogating him. They even called him a bunch of racial slurs because I guess they decided that if they were going to be arseholes, they may as well go all in on being arseholes. Or maybe they just genuinely hated black people. Both definitely possible. But since Henry wasn't going to give them any information, the police gave him information instead. They told him details of the crime scene and of Sabrina's autopsy, details that he would then have to repeat back to them, while forcing him to construct a story of what happened. There's a real killer out there. Someone killed an 11-year-old. And they're just like, how about we just close this case and get this guy? Because then an innocent guy will be in prison and a child rapist and murderer will be out and about. Why did you become policeman? I don't understand. It's worth noting that although Henry was 19 years old, he was evaluated as having the mental capacity of a 9-year-old child, so the police were brutally interrogating someone who was mentally a child and had no understanding of the position he was in. After about 90 minutes, Mammy and Leon arrived at the police station to see what was taking so long. However, by this point, Leon had now been implicated. With police forcing Henry to come up with a story of what happened, he had claimed that there were 4 other boys with him that all sexually assaulted and helped murder Sabrina, including his brother Leon. Based on this information, the police began interrogating Leon in a similar fashion. Neither boy had a lawyer during any of this mistake, and the police used threats of incarceration to force them to sign away their Miranda rights. That should be illegal if it is not illegal. I know this is about miscarriages of justice, right? So I'm going to assume these guys go to prison. How could that happen when this just seems like surely that would get a case thrown out immediately? Eventually, both interrogations ended in the same way. The police wrote up confessions based on the coerced statements Henry and Leon each had made, and then they were offered a choice. Either they could sign the confession and go home, or they could refuse to sign and be taken to the gas chamber. What the is happening? I know we've already covered how up it is that American police are allowed to lie about literally anything during interrogations, except your Miranda rights, but that sort of claim from the police is beyond words. Okay, so they're not allowed to lie about the Miranda rights. To make matters worse, neither one of the boys had any idea what they were actually signing. Henry didn't have the mental capacity to understand the language that was being used in the written confession, and Leon was borderline illiterate. In fact, despite being 15 years old, Leon wasn't able to properly sign his name on the confession. He had to write his name out in block lettering. After several hours of intense interrogation, Henry signed his confession at 2:30 a.m. He then got up to leave, since that was told what would happen when he was signed, but instead he was arrested. I mean, yeah, obviously, but he doesn't have the mental capacity to process that. Someone in a position of authority, a policeman, he trusted, and they just betrayed that. It's really fucked up. Sometime later, Leon's interrogation ended in a similar fashion. Right from the start, it should have been clear that something was wrong with all of this. I mean, absolutely everything was wrong with this, but even if we take the sociopathic stance that the police's interrogation methods were acceptable, the confessions that they'd coerced out of Henry and Leon didn't line up with one another or with reality. Although the story that there were 3 other boys involved, who those other people were, didn't match between the 2 stories. There were other details that didn't line up between the 2 confessions, and the confessions didn't line up with the facts. For example, one of the well, of course they don't. I mean, actually, the police could have done a better job at this. Like, they're basically feeding them what to say, and they still haven't got it right. Maybe the policeman here had I guess their IQs were slightly higher. Maybe around the 70 mark, maybe? For example, one of the confessions talked about someone stabbing Sabrina, but she didn't have any stab wounds. Upon looking into the other boys that Henry had named, it was also discovered that all 3 of them had airtight alibis. One of them wasn't even in the state. Despite how clearly fabricated these stories were, Henry and Leon were both charged with sexual assault and murder the same day that the confessions were signed. A couple of days later, Ethel came forward and admitted to making up the stories that she'd told the police about Henry simply because she thought he acted strange. So the police had confessions that they knew were coerced lies, and they had only worked so hard to extract those confessions because of statements Ethel made. Statements that she was now telling them were also lies. But they still had signed confessions, and that was apparently all that mattered to anyone involved in the case, because they're low IQ, lazy motherfuckers who just want to close the trial and possibly go get a coffee and a donut. Less than a month after Henry and Leon were arrested, but while they were still locked up awaiting trial, 18-year-old Joanne Brockman's body was found after she'd been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. Witnesses had last seen her with 43-year-old Roscoe Artis, a man with a 26-year history of sexual assaults and who was suspected of sexually assaulting and murdering another woman in 1980. Maybe we should look into old Roscoe. Maybe bring him in and see what's going on.
Case closed.
Roscoe was arrested after Joanne's murder. Excellent. And he quickly confessed to the crime. Excellent. I mean, unless he's been forced to do so, but he seems like the type of guy who would do this. Allegedly. He also made statements suggesting that Henry and Leon were innocent, though he did not confess to Sabrina's murder. He's like, you might have got the wrong guys. How do you know? Dunno. Just got a feeling about it. Wink, wink. What a sick fuck. Oh yes, this last bit is probably nothing, but Roscoe also happened to be living in a house right next to the soybean field where Sabrina's body was found. Based on this new information, the police decided that it sure was a wild coincidence that Sabrina had been sexually assaulted and murdered mere feet from where another unrelated murder and sex criminal happened to live. It wasn't a coincidence worth investigating, though, so Sabrina and Joanne's murders were treated as though they were completely disconnected from one another. In August of 1984, Roscoe was sentenced to death for Joanne's murder, though this would later be commuted to a life sentence. Before his death sentence was commuted, he'd reportedly told a fellow death row inmate numerous times that Henry and Leon were innocent, and he seemed to express guilt about them being behind bars, despite still not confessing to Sabrina's murder. Not important at all. Why would that be important? 2 months later, the trial began. The prosecuting attorney was a man named Joe Freeman Britt, a man who took exceptional glee in his ability to get people sentenced to death. Wow, that's up. I'm not against the death penalty, as we've established. I've done a true crime show long enough to know that some people deserve to die. Like the guy who sexually assaulted and murdered an 11-year-old. Right? In 1988, he was even awarded the Guinness World Record for deadliest prosecutor in America, though much like with most prolific serial killer, Guinness has since decided they no longer want to publish those sorts of records. Good move, Guinness, because some might say that having the Guinness World Record for being a serial killer is, I don't know, maybe a little bit tasteless. The main evidence against Henry and Leon during their trial was their confessions. And by the main evidence, I mean the only evidence. There was a witness who claimed to have overheard Henry and Leon planning the crime beforehand, but the defense was able to sufficiently discredit this witness as being nothing but a filthy liar, as he had been interrogated 3 times by the police without ever bringing these claims up. It wasn't until after Henry and Leon were already charged with murder that the supposed witness concocted this story. The defense also pointed out how there was absolutely no physical evidence against the boys. There was physical evidence, such as the beer cans, but the fingerprints on those cans didn't match either of the accused. Are these guys going to get the DNA sorted out? Because the cigarette butts and the cans, surely they're still in evidence. They'll swipe some DNA. They'll take some DNA off. I assume they'll have some DNA samples taken from the body of the child. And they'll run those later and these guys will get exonerated. Right? The verdict was based entirely on the 2 coerced and inconsistent confessions, and that verdict was guilty. Henry and Leon were both sentenced to death, with Leon becoming North Carolina's youngest death row inmate. You know, guys, they're just boys. They're just boys with mental ages of children. However, in 1988, the verdict was overturned on appeal based on faulty jury instructions. The jury hadn't been told to consider the guilt of the 2 boys individually, instead treating them as a package deal. They were entitled to new, separate trials so they could be adjudicated individually, but once again, both boys were convicted. Henry was again convicted of both murder and sexual assault and sentenced to death, but Leon was only convicted of the sexual assault, so he was sentenced to life imprisonment. During the course of the appeals, some new information came out. Most notably, the police didn't actually disregard Roscoe's possible involvement as flippantly as I had suggested. After he confessed to Joanne's murder, the police actually requested that his fingerprints be compared against the fingerprints found on the beer cans. That same day, the prosecutors had cancelled their request without any explanation. Although none of that information had been disclosed to the defense attorneys, it wasn't enough to overturn the conviction on appeal. In 2004, Henry requested that DNA from the physical evidence in the case be examined. DNA samples were taken from the cigarette butts, and those samples were not a match for either Henry or Leon. There we go. However, the technology at the time did not allow them to definitively link the DNA to any other suspect. Right? That's fine. But just because they haven't found someone new doesn't mean that the old guys are guilty.
Overruled.
So it was ruled that this evidence alone wasn't enough to let either man out of prison. Come on. Can't someone look at this and be like, what the f***? Unsurprisingly, prison was really rough for Henry and Leon. They had been convicted of sexually assaulting and murdering a child, so they were treated pretty much exactly the way you would expect. However, not everyone thought they were guilty. Good. In 2010, a fellow inmate suggested to Henry that he could reach out to the North Carolina Innocence Inquiry Commission. The goal of this commission is obviously similar to that of the Innocence Project, but because it's a state agency, the commission actually has the authority to compel certain actions. Henry wasn't able to fill out the necessary paperwork to request help from the commission on his own, so he had another inmate fill out the paperwork for him. Good. The commission decided to take up the case, and they requested DNA evidence be checked against the state's database. The DNA came back as a match for Roscoe. Bada bing, bada boom. Roscoe is a sicko. Get him on death row. The commission continued to investigate the case for the next 4 years, uncovering all sorts of potentially exculpatory evidence that the police department had intentionally hidden from the defense attorneys. For example, in 2014, the commission had even more DNA evidence tested, this time against CODIS, the National DNA Registry. It wasn't until that evidence, again matched with Roscoe's DNA, that Henry and Leon's attorneys even found out that there was a well-known sex criminal living mere feet from where Sabrina's body had been discovered. While you could argue that the lawyers could have done a better job in uncovering that information on their own, it was still something that should have been disclosed to them decades earlier. In September of that year, the Innocence Inquiry Commission and the brothers' lawyers brought the case before a judge. They laid out all the exculpatory evidence and evidence of police misconduct and requested that Henry and Leon be released immediately. All that stood in their way was the district attorney, Johnson Britt. Johnson was the first cousin twice removed of the former prosecutor Joe Britt. But the two men had very different philosophies regarding prosecution. Excellent. Johnson saw Joe as an aggressive bully. I thought this was going to go a completely different way. Excellent. Who steamrolled people to get his way. Joe's response was, well, let's say, if I was a bully, he's a pussy. This guy sounds like he's what a cock. Family drama aside, Johnson was the final potential hurdle in the exoneration of Henry and Leon. He told the judge, the state does not have a case. The whole case rests on the confessions, and the DNA evidence threw those confessions under the bus. After hearing all of this, the judge declared both men innocent, and after 31 years in prison, Christ, they were finally free. Or at least they would be free the following day. Their lawyers need to fill out a bunch of paperwork first. In the previous case, we saw a rather large settlement awarded for the wrongful imprisonment of the Central Park Five. The men received $40 million for their roughly 40 combined years behind bars. So what do you think would be an appropriate apology to the two men who spent 31 years in prison for a crime that they didn't commit? 31 years, but this was a long time before. Oh no, it wasn't. It was around the same time. Well, I'd say, Kevin's asking me if it's going to be lower. I'm going to say 10 million, and that's like extremely low end of what would be acceptable. Unfortunately, no, the answer to that question was 45... Wait, hold up. $45? I literally went in to read that as $45 million with glee. But the question was $45. The answer was $45. What? Although a new judge had declared them innocent and ordered them to be released from prison, Henry and Leon had never actually been pardoned. So due to some loophole that I can't figure out, they were somehow simultaneously both guilty and innocent. But without a pardon, $45 was all they were allowed to receive. They spent the next year surviving on charity and donations. The following year, North Carolina Governor Pat McCrory officially pardoned them, citing it as the right thing to do. I don't understand why they need a pardon. They should have been regarded as never guilty. I guess a pardon does that, but surely it's just like, oh no, it's like, I know a pardon is like it never happened, but you still got pardoned. They should not need a pardon. It just should be like, well, you're not guilty. We're really sorry that you went to prison for 31 years. Here's $30 million. Carry on with your lives. By the way, just... it's a lot of money, but that. If someone's like, do you want to go to prison for a year for $1 million? No. Do you want to go for $5 million for 5 years? No. No, I do not. I know it's life-changing money, but I do not. This was absolutely correct, though the right thing to do would have never been to convict them in the first place. But there was still some pushback. Both Joe Britt and Sabrina's family vehemently opposed the pardon as they still felt that Henry and Leon were guilty. Fantastic, you can feel whatever the fuck you like, but your feelings are not reality here. I'm sorry, I know you're the family of someone who had a horrible, horrible thing happen to them, but you're living in a place that is not reality. And you could fuck right off with that, with all due respect. Sabrina's family thought that anyway. Joe might have just been a bit upset about how this would sully his record as deadliest prosecutor. Joe, you sound like a right... I'm glad your cousin, or whatever he is, cousin-in-law, cousin, something like that. Cousin twice removed. Well, I guess he got removed from your bell-ended nature. It also didn't help that although there was DNA evidence pointing to Roscoe's guilt, along with his many statements about Henry and Leon's innocence, he was never put on trial for Sabrina's murder. Roscoe died in prison in 2020. Oh no! And he died without ever confessing or being tried for Sabrina's death. His statements to his fellow death row inmate had included... Oh, was he killed? Excellent. Wait, he died in prison or was he executed? Oh, I'd rather he was executed. His statements to fellow death row inmate had included details that were not publicly known, such as the colour of Sabrina's underwear. But he never explicitly confessed, he just stated that the other men were innocent. Had Roscoe been convicted of the sexual assault and murder, perhaps Sabrina's family wouldn't have been so upset about Henry and Leon receiving a pardon. I feel like you just look at the information and be like, oh, okay, cool. But apparently not. Regardless, now that they were pardoned, they might be eligible for actual compensation from the state. They were awarded $750,000 each. The maximum compensation in the state of North Carolina. Oh no. Along with another $500,000 settlement from the town of Red Springs and the officers involved. That is not enough. That is not enough at all. Unfortunately, people who become exonerated and receive government compensation for wrongful imprisonment are often the target of financial predators. Oh no, and everyone knows that they're not very bright, which makes them easy targets. This was exacerbated by the fact that both were mentally disabled, making them easier prey. Between their lawyers, their sister, and predatory lenders, Henry and Leon were not only bankrupt within 7 months, they were in debt. One lawyer had stolen approximately $250,000 from them, and much of their money was spent on cars and women's jewelry, purchases that the men had not made or authorized, at least not knowingly. Some people, are such pieces of shit. A lawyer to do that? You should have professional standards, f*** you. After losing all the money, Henry began taking predatory loans with 38% interest, and by 2017 he owed $130,000 to these loan sharks. It was a rough next few years, but finally things turned around. In March of 2021, a judge ordered Henry and Leon's attorney to pay back the $250,000 that he'd stolen from them. How about you just take it from him and put him in fucking prison? He's a lawyer and he stole his client's money. That's crazy. It would be like if your brother stole $250,000 from you. It would be bad. It's not as bad as your fucking lawyer stealing that money from you. That is, I feel $250,000 should be prison territory anyway if you're stealing $250,000 off someone. But if it's a lawyer, definitely prison territory. Definitely take their what do you call it in America? Their license. Bar card. Is it a bar card? Is that a thing? Take that away. His license to practice law was also suspended for 5 years. Personally, I think it should have been revoked permanently. Yeah, no shit. I think it should have been revoked permanently. Then do not pass go. Do not collect $200. Go straight to jail. But we'll see if anyone will actually be willing to hire him next year once the suspension ends. I'd wager that the state no longer will allow him to work as a public defender. Fortunately, that wasn't quite the end of the story for Henry and Leon. Though $750,000 had been the maximum compensation they could get from the state of North Carolina, they were still able to obtain a settlement from the federal government. Okay, here we go. Let's talk money. And federal government money. And the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation picked arguably the worst lawyer they could find to represent them in federal court for the 2021 hearing. Oh no. Despite the fact that the brothers had been exonerated 7 years earlier, the lawyer referred to them as murderers and multiple times during his closing statement. He's your lawyer, what? These statements were obviously objected to, and the judge had to remind the jury that such claims by prosecution were inappropriate. What? So when the judge had to tell the jury, please don't listen to this guy, during his closing statement, you could probably guess which way the trial went. Oh, I'm so sorry. I've got this completely twisted. For some reason, I thought their lawyer was being an idiot. It's the state's lawyer being an idiot. Oh, that's brilliant. Oh, now I love it. Oh, wait, that reads completely differently. So the judge is like, don't listen to the prosecution. Of course, I should have seen that. The state's lawyer is like, no. The judge is like, no, shut up. Don't listen to him. At the end of the trial, Henry and Leon each received $31 million. $1 million for each year in jail, plus a shared $13 million in punitive damages. Mwah! It was the largest award for a wrongful conviction settlement in US history, and rightfully so. This time, the brothers were each also given a court-appointed guardian to oversee their finances and make sure they weren't robbed blind again. That court-appointed guardian better be indebted. His last lawyer stole $250,000 from him. The financial windfall, along with the security that their money would remain theirs, was certainly a boon for Henry and Leon. But in many ways, the damage was already done. Yeah, boy. Like, $30 million. A lot of money. Fantastic. Oh, more than that. 31 plus 13. Brilliant. But 31 years behind bars is going to fuck you right up. They had been imprisoned as teenagers and spent 31 years behind bars. Henry sat on death row for that time, and he attempted to take his own life after one of the other death row inmates was executed. Leon had suffered such severe abuse at the hands of other prisoners that he had to be given a court-appointed therapist after the settlement to help him manage the deep psychological trauma that he lives with every day. Yeah, no kidding. Then there was the damage to their reputations and the way the case had been weaponized. Sure, they're exonerated now, but for years they were presumed guilty. North Carolina's Republican Party used Henry's mugshot in campaign mailers as a form of fear-mongering, accusing the Democrats of being soft on crime. His face was used in campaigns as recently as 2010. Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia also used their case as a way to justify the existence of the death penalty, which has been argued as unconstitutional. He also used the case as an example of wild teen killers, a problem he seemed to believe was pervasive all over the country. Justice Scalia even mentioned Henry and Leon's case in his opinion on a completely unrelated case, just to highlight how necessary the death penalty was. Bro, not a good look now. Even if they had been exonerated, those statements against them will forever exist in the opinion for that Supreme Court case. And of course, with all the statements that were made about them for decades, there is some number of people who still believe that Henry and Leon are guilty, even though the courts had ruled otherwise. For much of the time after they were released from prison, the brothers still weren't truly free either. Leon required full-time care, and he had to be committed to a psychiatric hospital 7 times in just 3 years because of all the trauma from prison. Henry was living in a group home after his release by order of the court. He told a reporter, "A judge put me here. I want my freedom." Things did get better after the $75 million payout, though, at least for Henry. He moved to Virginia with his fiancée, and the two are currently scheduled to get married next July. Congratulations. At the time of writing anyway, by the time this video gets published, they may already be married. Henry did state that he wanted to move Leon to Virginia with him, but I can't find any information on Leon's current whereabouts. It's possible that he's still in and out of psychiatric facilities, though hopefully the court-appointed therapy has kept him from needing to be institutionalized again. After all, if someone has trauma from being locked up in prison, I doubt being locked up in hospital is going to be fantastic for their mental health. They may eventually be freed, but it's impossible to know just how many people were in situations similar to Henry and Leon. As North Carolina's Center for Death Penalty Litigation wrote, quoting, "Henry and Leon's case is not so much a lesson in how wrongful convictions are uncovered as it is a warning of how easily they can be missed entirely. If not for that single cigarette butt, Henry and Leon would likely have remained in prison for the rest of their lives. Henry might have been executed." Unfortunately, despite what a horrible miscarriage of justice this case was, it's unlikely to make a difference in the grand scheme of things. Henry and Leon's case has been cited by different Supreme Court justices, both to argue for and against the death penalty, so our legal system is far from coming to consensus on, well, pretty much anything. Yeah. Jesus, that's depressing. The only thing that's not depressing about that is they got $75 million, which is a lot of money. Cameron Todd Willingham. Our previous 2 stories involve people being wrongly convicted for crimes they didn't commit. The upside of such a miscarriage of justice is that the real perpetrator of the crimes could eventually be found and brought to justice, resulting in your release. I'm obviously not arguing that we should randomly convict people and sort it all out later while they're in prison. Kevin, I did think you were, mate. But at least these situations have the possibility of being rectified. An arguably worse miscarriage of justice is for a person to be wrongly convicted of a crime that didn't even happen. When that happens, the convicted can't be exonerated once the real culprit is identified because there is no real culprit to find. If you're currently pondering, how a person could be convicted of a crime that didn't happen, well, Simon, allow me to introduce you to one of the most important things humanity ever learned to harness: the power of fire. Okay, so maybe something burned down and then someone was accused of doing his arson, but it wasn't arson, it was just a fire?
Magic.
Now, arson investigations are a tricky thing, because there's an additional layer of mystery that needs to be solved. If you were to stumble across a dead body that was shot in the head, you would need to figure out who the murderer was. I mean, not you personally. No. The police and the detectives would figure that out. But if you were to come across a building that burned down with a person inside, first you would have to determine whether the fire was intentionally set, and if so, by whom. Unfortunately, answering that first question is far from straightforward. And that brings us to the case of Cameron Todd Willingham. Cameron was born on the 8th of January 1968 in Ardmore, Oklahoma. He was abandoned by his mother as a baby, so Cameron was raised by his father and his stepmother once his father remarried. His father owned an auto salvage yard, though the family was poor and lived in a tiny house beside the train tracks. Don't imagine there's a ton of money in auto salvage. While salvage yards can definitely make good money, okay, there we go. It was a borderline rural community, so there were fewer potential customers than junkyards in urban areas. Still, Cameron learned to do mechanical work for his father, which could have been great for his future, especially if he moved to a city with more cars in need of servicing. Unfortunately, Cameron was a bit of a loser. Oh.
Why are you the way that you are?
It's a bit harsh. He dropped out of school in the 10th grade, which wasn't necessarily a bad thing by default. After all, he had already learned a trade from his father, one that pays decently well and is typically in high demand. So he could have dropped out of school with dreams of working and saving up money to buy his own auto shop. That's certainly something that he could have done. But he didn't do that. Instead, he dropped out of school so he could loaf around and huff paint and glue. Oh yeah, that was a thing people did. Do people still do that? Is there still solvents in paint and glue, or did they take that away because people kept getting high on it? I remember this being a thing when I was a kid. Like, not as a kid when I was, like, of the age of doing drugs, but when I was a kid, you'd talk about people sniffing glue, like you understood what that meant. And you'd be like, yeah, people sniff glue, and you get a Pritt stick and be like, it's like not the glue for children whistle. Over the next few years, he also ran afoul of the law about a dozen times for burglary, theft, driving under the influence, and providing paint to minors. Oh, because of the solvents, okay. Although he was able to avoid jail and was only on probation. As a teenager, Cameron moved to Gainesville in Texas, where he met a high school senior named Stacy Kuykendall. I believe Cameron was 19 and Stacy was 17 at the time, though depending on what month they met, she might have been 18 already. Cameron and Stacy started an on-again, off-again relationship that resulted in them moving in together in Corsicana in Texas. But they would frequently get into fights, with Cameron allegedly being both physically and verbally abusive to Stacy, including while she was pregnant. Classy guy, this Cameron. He was also reported to be a heavy drinker who frequently cheated on Stacy. Yeah, he's also huffing glue and stuff. However, according to Cameron, the kids did a lot to fix their relationship. He said, "I think those babies is what brought us so close together. Neither one of us could live without them kids." In total, they had 3 daughters together. First was their daughter Amber, then a year later the twins Cameron and Carmen. Since they were living together and having children, in October of 1991, Cameron and Stacy finally got married. Cameron had been working as a mechanic at the time, but he unfortunately lost his job the following month. Stacy still had a job working at her brother's bar, but that was the family's only income now. So things were not going great for the family, and there was already evidence that Cameron wasn't exactly the best person ever, but there was still plenty of time to turn their lives around. I mean, after all, Cameron and Stacy were only 23 and 21 respectively, so this period of unemployment and underemployment could pass, and they could move on to bigger and better things. Yes, these things happened. Life has its ups and downs. It is what it is. There's a whole life opportunity ahead of you, 23 and 21-year-old, with 3 children, good lord. And that brings us to the morning of December 23rd, barely 2 months after the wedding. 2 houses down from the Willinghams, an 11-year-old girl with a ridiculous name was playing in a backyard. All of a sudden, Buffy Barbie... Really? Smelled smoke. She ran... Buffy Barbie? She ran inside and told her mother, Diane. Her mother has the most regular-ass name in the world. And then the two ran up the street together to see what was happening. When they got to the Willingham's house, they saw Cameron outside. He was wearing nothing but a pair of jeans. His hair was singed and his chest was covered in soot. Cameron yelled at them to call the fire department, saying, "My babies are burning up." Oh, God. Stacy had left early that morning to go to the Salvation Army thrift store to buy some presents for Christmas, but Amber and the twins were all inside. While Diane ran back to her house, Buffy watched as Cameron grabbed a stick and broke one of the windows to his daughter's bedroom. Presumably his goal was to try and access their bedroom from the window so he could rescue them, but this was actually a terrible idea. Yeah, you can't open a door or break a window. It's going to let all the air in and the fire gets crazy. This was a terrible idea. Breaking the window just provided more airflow for the fire, making it stronger. I don't think most people in that situation would be thinking things through clearly, so I'm not going to hold the broken window against Cameron. It was just an unfortunate reality that this decision made things worse. Yeah, I think I'd probably not be in. I'd just be like, gotta get in there. Diane returned after calling the fire department, at which point the flames inside the girls' room became so intense that all 5 windows shattered, flames erupting out of the newly created openings. Wait, is this guy going to lose his 3 children and then be wrongfully convicted of murdering them because he burned the house down? That is... We had some fucked up stuff so far, but holy... Can you imagine? Firefighters arrived on the scene within minutes, and at times Cameron had to be restrained from trying to run into the house to rescue his kids. He even gave one of the first responders a black eye and had to be placed in handcuffs to keep him from hurting himself or anyone else. Yeah, I mean, I of course, I don't blame him at all. I know the firefighters there to help, but I mean, you're just not in your right mind. As firefighters made their way through the house, they brought the bodies of the young girls outside one by one. All 3 had died of smoke inhalation. The babies were found in their bedroom while Amber was in the master bedroom. Cameron was taken to the hospital, though he didn't have any serious injuries and wasn't suffering smoke inhalation, so he was released. 4 days after the fire, arson investigators went to search the home, having received permission from Cameron. He told them, "I know we might not ever know all the answers, but I'd just like to know why my babies were taken from me." Christ. Guys, this is chilling. The scene was investigated by Douglas Fogg, the assistant fire chief for Corsicana, and Manuel Vasquez, one of the state's leading arson investigators. He was so good that nearly every fire he investigated turned out to be arson. Manuel testified in court that of the 1,200 to 1,500 fires he investigated, with the exception of a few, most all of them were arson. That's extremely concerning. That is a suspiciously high number. Now, to be fair, the state isn't going to call in their arson investigators on a fire that they know is an accident, but the Texas State Fire Marshal's Office reported that only about 50% of investigated fires were ruled as arson, give or take a few percentage points each year. The massive disparity between 50% and nearly 100% suggests that either every other arson investigator in Texas sucked at their job, or that maybe Manuel's reputation far outpaced his actual ability. Anyway, after investigating the home, Cameron was interviewed by Manuel and Douglas to explain what happened to them the morning of the fire. As he explained it, Stacy had left to go and buy Christmas presents, and he got up at around 8 a.m. to give Cameron and Carmen their morning bottles. After feeding the babies, he let them sleep on the floor, which was just something he and Stacy did. Amber was still asleep, so Cameron decided to go back to bed. At around 9 a.m., Cameron was woken up by Amber, who ran into his room screaming, "Daddy, Daddy!" Realizing the whole house was on fire, Cameron yelled at Amber to get outside. Then he threw on a pair of jeans and tried to get to the twins. The hallway was filled with smoke, so he had to crawl along the floor. There was a little safety gate blocking the door to the girl's bedroom. It was small enough that the 2-year-old Amber could climb over it, but it would keep the babies from crawling out of the room and all over the house. Cameron stood up to get over the gate, at which point his hair caught fire. He patted the fire on his head out, and then he got back to the ground, reaching around for his girls. Unfortunately, though, he couldn't find them. There was too much smoke to see where they were, and he couldn't reach them. Even worse, he could feel himself getting close to passing out from the intense heat and smoke. He escaped back outside, at which point he saw the Barbies and told them to call the fire department. As for why Amber was found in the master bedroom, Cameron said that he'd been unaware of her presence in the room once he got his pants on, but she might have passed out from smoke inhalation shortly after waking him up. There were also 2 doorways leading to the master bedroom, so she could have returned to the room to look for her dad after he'd already left his bed without them running into one another. There were also 2 potential ways that Cameron believed that the fire could have started. As he made his way to the girl's bedroom, he heard the electrical sockets and switches popping and crackling. This led him to believe that it was probably an electrical fire. There was also a space heater in the girl's bedroom, one that used an internal flame rather than being fully electric, and there was the chance that it might have somehow caused the fire. Yeah, that's like space heaters are kind of dangerous, right? Especially like back in the day. Seeing as she was a curious 2-year-old, Amber was known to sometimes play with the space heater and put things near it. Yeah, that's not good, even though her parents had both made it very clear she was not supposed to. Cameron even said that she got whoppings every once in a while for messing with it, but she would still occasionally put things too close to the heater. Well, yeah, she's 2. Look, I've had 2-year-olds. I know what 2-year-olds like. You could tell them don't do that, and they'll still do that because they don't understand yet. I feel as a parent, you've got to be like, okay, cool, well, we don't have a space heater, or we don't put the kids near the space heater, right? It's not their fault. That was all Cameron's version of events, as he told it to the arson investigators. But Manuel had just one question for him. Was he wearing shoes? Cameron said that no, he was not. And Manuel then used a map of the house the investigators had drawn to confirm Cameron's escape route. Realistically, there was only one way out, but after confirming which direction he had gone and that he was barefoot, Manuel was positive that Cameron had intentionally set the fire to murder his own children. But why, Manuel? But the general public disagreed. Everyone said that Cameron was such a nice guy who loved his children and he would never have done anything like this. It was a tragic accident, and the community really felt for Cameron and Stacy. They had even held a fundraiser to help the family out, and people were heartbroken over their loss. Understandably so. It's fucking horrible. That all changed on January the 8th, 1992. 2 weeks after the fire had burned down their home and ended the lives of their 3 children, Cameron and Stacy were driving around somewhere. I'm not sure where they were going at the time, but it doesn't matter because they never got there. Instead, the car was surrounded by SWAT vehicles and forced to the side of the road. SWAT teams pulled out their guns and took Cameron out of the car to arrest him. He was taken into custody, where he was charged with arson and murder. And because there were multiple victims, under Texas law, that meant that the death penalty was on the table. Well, that's f***ed up. After Cameron was arrested and charged with murder, fucking hell, everyone's opinion changed. Not only did their opinions change, but so did the accounts of witnesses who'd seen the fire. Whereas before it was stated that Cameron had been alternating between an immobilized state of shock and frantically trying to rescue his kids, now witnesses said that he seemed completely unbothered by the fire until the firefighters showed up, at which point they felt like he was putting on a show. Holy shit, what's going on? One witness also highlighted how Cameron moved his car at one point during the fire, saying that he seemed more concerned with his car than with his kids. While that did happen, Cameron explained that he moved the car because it was too close to the house and he didn't want it to explode and make the fire worse. But after the arrest, there were far fewer stories about him being a nice guy and more tales of the abusive unemployed husband with a criminal record. This sort of shift in witnesses' testimony is surprisingly common. If someone who is initially perceived as innocent gets labelled as a suspect by the police, witnesses do have a tendency to change their story to fit the narrative of the person's guilt. That's all part of this railroading procedure, isn't it? Usually this is neither malicious nor something that even happens consciously, but people are prone to reevaluating what they saw in the new context, and their memories can change to fit what they now believe. It's not malicious necessarily, sometimes your brain just makes it up to fit a story. Memories are not very reliable. Seeing as the neighbours who painted Cameron in an incriminating light are the same ones who previously defended him before his arrest, we should probably just disregard their statements as unreliable. Yes, indeed. So what happened? How did Cameron go from the victim of a horrible tragedy to being public enemy number one, and what the does this have to do with whether or not he was wearing shoes? Well, buckle up, because I've got buckle up, like a shoe buckle. I don't know if that's intentional, because I've got some incredibly shoddy evidence for you. When Manuel examined the house, there were a few things he noticed. First, there was a back door to the house in the kitchen, but the door appeared to be blocked off by a refrigerator. Despite the fact that he found there was enough room for him to get outside using the back door, he took the opinion that the refrigerator had been moved to block the door and trap the children inside. Okie dokie, but okay, Manuel could get through? Was he smaller than a child? Other explanations that don't appear to have been given any thought by the investigation were either that the kitchen was cramped, so there was nowhere else to put the fridge, or that the door was blocked to keep Amber from running outside without her parents. I don't know if you know this about me, Simon, but I used to once be a kid. I did know that about Kevin, actually. We talked about it many times. Otherwise, I wouldn't have known. And as a kid, I absolutely ran around everywhere and was a pain in the arse for my parents to keep track of. Limiting the number of ways your kid can escape the house in order to make them easier to watch isn't the craziest idea in the world, even if it isn't a great idea in the event of an emergency. No, but I mean, of course, like you lock, like, I've got kids. You keep the doors locked because you don't want them going outside, because the chances of them going outside and getting hit by a car are a lot higher than the chance of them being trapped inside in a house fire. It's just stats. And in a fire anyway, you've got to be rescuing them. They're children. They're 2 years old. And babies. They're not going to be able to make their own way out of the house. More important to the investigation, however, were the pour patterns. If you've ever seen something burning, you should know that fire burns up, not down. Indeed, when gases become heated, they become less dense, which causes them to rise. This results in walls and ceilings being burned much more than floors, which may sustain little to no actual burning. But when a liquid accelerant is used, that accelerant will burn along the ground and leave what are referred to as pour patterns or puddle configurations. In the girl's bedroom, the floor seemed to be more severely burned than the ceiling, so Manuel concluded that a liquid accelerant must have been used, as that was his only way to explain the pour patterns. Glass from the broken windows also had a spiderweb pattern of damage, something fire investigators refer to as crazed glass. The glass being damaged in such a fashion suggested that the fire burned fast and hot, which again pointed to the use of a liquid accelerant. Based on the damage to various rooms, it was concluded that the fire began in the girl's bedroom, went out through the hallway, and then came out the front door. I mean, okay, if this is actually real, I'm very skeptical because of the 99.9% or whatever thing of this dude being like, it's always arson, when 50% of the time, everywhere else, it's not. So I'm very skeptical of this, but this does seem like some evidence.
Stop that! The fire inspector would be appalled.
Kevin called it shoddy. I guess we'll find out why. There are also 3 V patterns of soot on the walls. When a fire first begins to burn, the heat and smoke expands outwards, creating a distinctive V shape. These patterns on the wall can be used to identify where a fire began. Since there were 3 V patterns found, Manuel came to believe that Cameron had poured a liquid accelerant in the girl's room, in the hall, and at the front door. He then lit the bedroom on fire before igniting the hall and doorway on his way out. This created a wall of fire to trap everyone inside. Now, admittedly, this evidence doesn't sound nearly as shoddy as you were probably expecting, indeed, Kevster. In fact, it sounds downright logical and scientific. However, that requires not only for everything Manuel stated to be accurate, but for it to be the only explanation. And he should have been well aware that it was not. There's also one other fun thing that came up when the burn patterns were evaluated. Simon, take a look at this document and tell me if you notice anything peculiar about the shape of the burn patterns in the girl's bedroom. Bedroom, girl's bedroom, I guess that's there. Okay. Wow, this house is kind of exactly how I pictured it in my mind. Okay. Well, it seems to be all over the place. I don't know. I'm sorry, Kevin. I don't know if I see anything. Did you see it, Simon? The unmistakable shape of a pentagram burned into the floor. No? What are you talking about? That's right, this wasn't just murder, it was demonic sacrifice. Oh, okay, look, people are seeing patterns when patterns aren't there. There is no pentagram, what are you talking about? Oh, I see it. No, come on, that's ridiculous.
Now let's hear from the devil first.
Really, though, that should have been obvious to anyone who set foot in the Willingham's home. The walls were covered in Iron Maiden and Led Zeppelin posters, so clearly whoever lived there must have been some sort of Satan-worshipping monster. You know, ignoring the fact that Led Zeppelin's music was all about love and longing, as well as hobbits. The investigators also noted a brown residue on the floor, something they claimed was left behind by the accelerant. Samples of burned material were collected and tested in a lab, and one of the samples, taken from near the threshold of the front door, tested positive for charcoal lighter fluid. As for why it mattered whether or not Cameron was wearing shoes, his feet hadn't been burned or covered in soot. Since the investigators were operating on the assumption that a liquid accelerant was used, they believed it would have been impossible for Cameron to escape the house through the hall and out the front door without burning his feet, unless he'd been pouring the accelerant and lighting it on his way out. Okay, but again, yeah, interesting point. But you've got to be like 99.9, beyond all reasonable doubt, right, guys? Right? Cameron had described the fire as only being on the walls and the ceiling at the time, not yet on the floor, but the investigators simply didn't believe him. Which is fine, the investigators cannot believe him, because then it will go to court, he'll get a fire expert on his side and be like, guys, this is bullshit. At least that's what I hope. But given that this is the travesties of justice, I guess my hopes are not going to be met. With the arrest now made, all that was left to do was build the case against Cameron. The forensics allegedly pointed to arson, but prosecutors needed to prove not only was the fire arson, but that Cameron was the one who set the fire. He was the only person in the house, and the family didn't have any enemies, so there wasn't another obvious suspect. There was still the possibility that it was an accident rather than intentional, but nobody seemed to be taking that possibility seriously thanks to the determination of the arson investigator. Always thinks it's arson.
Arson's a nasty habit.
Of course, that does raise the question of motive. Why would Cameron want his children dead? And to that, there didn't seem to be an obvious answer. The girls did have life insurance policies. Really? Which did seem a bit weird for the 90s, but those policies had been purchased and paid out to Stacy's grandfather. Why would you have a life insurance policy for a kid? To cover, burial costs and stuff like that? If you have a life insurance policy as the breadwinner in a family, that makes sense, because if you die, then, your spouse is going to need the financial support. But a kid? I'm not sure why. Maybe there must be a reason, otherwise it wouldn't exist. I just thought it would be for burial expenses and stuff, so that can't be enough money for it to be a reason. But you're also, because you're going to have to go and meet those burial expenses, because there's people to be buried. Look, in a previous episode, I wrote about how back in the day when child mortality was much higher, it was common to have a life insurance policy on children to cover the cost of their funerals. Okay, there we go. It's probably why I know it. I must have read it previously. I don't know exactly how old Stacy's grandfather was, but he likely grew up when this was still more common than not and just decided to keep the tradition alive. All 3 policies totaled only $15,000, so it's unlikely that money provided a motive for anyone. Yeah, especially because it's going to the grandfather. It's not even going directly to him. And since there wasn't an obvious motive present, the prosecution just had to create one on their own. They decided Cameron was upset about having children while he was so young, and he wanted to get rid of them so he could have more time to get drunk and play darts. Not that there was much to support this claim. Also, you can just do that. Plenty of dads just f*** off. And while I don't think that's a good idea, it's better than murdering your children, isn't it? And also, he didn't f***ing do that. The prosecution argued that Cameron had kicked his wife in the stomach while pregnant to try and end the pregnancies. Do you have anything to support that? But there doesn't seem to be any evidence supporting this. As for the idea that all he cared about was playing darts, that came from something that happened shortly after the fire. Cameron returned to the house, accompanied by a firefighter, in order to try and salvage any personal belongings. This is a pretty typical thing to happen after a fire, but it was noted that Cameron was really upset that he couldn't find his dart set. I mean, this dude has just lost 3 of his children in a fire. He's like, you'd be like, I can't find my dart set. The firefighter would be like, dude, it doesn't matter, it's just a dart. I can't find my dart set. Where's my dart set? I can't find... it's just not... He's not right. It was determined that this was extremely suspicious because reasons. Did the dart set have some special significance to Cameron? Maybe it was a present given to him by somebody who'd since passed away, so it was very important. Or maybe he was just emotionally shattered by the loss of his children and just wanted to empty his mind for a few minutes and engage in a hobby that had typically brought him joy. Those explanations are purely speculative on my part, but I think they're pretty reasonable. However, nothing like this seems to have been brought up to counter the claims that Cameron's behavior was suspicious. That could be because of the lawyers Cameron had, who were not great. I mean, look, maybe they were perfectly fine lawyers, but they were definitely not the right lawyers for this case. Cameron couldn't afford to hire an attorney, so he was given 2 public defenders, neither of whom specialized in murder or capital punishment cases. Okay. They also didn't actually believe Cameron's story and thought that he was guilty. Well, fuck off. Which would make it harder for them to zealously advocate for his innocence. Fuck off, do your job. As the trial approached, the eventual outcome seemed all too clear. The odds of an acquittal were virtually non-existent, but an opportunity presented itself in the form of a plea bargain. Oh God, he's going to plea bargain. He's going to plea bargain to something he didn't do. Oh, a number of Stacey's relatives didn't want to go through the emotional pain of a trial, so they requested that the prosecutor offer Cameron a deal. All he had to do was plead guilty, and he'd receive life in prison instead of potentially facing the death penalty. Oh my God, Jesus.
It's a disaster, man. We gotta stop it.
Life in prison would suck, but since it seemed obvious which way the trial would go, this was the best deal Cameron was going to get. But against the advice of his lawyers and parents, he said no dice. He refused to confess to a crime he hadn't committed, especially the murder of his own daughters. Yeah, I mean... Yeah, I'd be like, no, I didn't. You, but I'd also get really expensive lawyers. And so, in August of 1992, the case went to trial. Despite being a death penalty case, the trial only lasted for 2 days. The prosecution had the scientific testimony of their arson investigators, as well as 2 other key witnesses. The first was a psychiatrist by the name of James Grigson, better known as Dr. Death. It's not a great nickname to have as a doctor, is it? He was one of 2 mental health professionals to examine Cameron before the trial, the other being a psychologist who basically only did marriage counselling. I use the phrase examine Cameron quite loosely here, though, as I don't believe either of them had ever actually met or spoken with Cameron. What the fuck? This isn't a witness? What? Come on! Oh, I kind of glossed over that whole Dr. Death thing, didn't I? So, James's main gig appears to have been testifying as an expert witness in court, specifically in cases of capital punishment. He testified in 167 cases, nearly all of which resulted in the accused being given the death penalty, in no small part to his testimony. I hope you feel like the piece of shit you are, Grigson. Allegedly, in my opinion, you're a piece of shit. This is the acts of a piece of shit, in my opinion. Allegedly. You see, in order to give someone the death penalty in Texas, it has to be proven that the person presents a future danger to society, that if the person isn't executed, they will likely hurt or kill someone again. For most people, that's a hard judgment to make. After all, nobody can predict the future. Nobody except Dr. Death, that is. In every case, James would describe the accused as being an incurable sociopath who had a 100% chance to kill again if not executed. He would use those exact words to describe every defendant, yet nobody seemed to notice a pattern. So how did he arrive at the conclusion that Cameron was an incurable sociopath without ever actually talking to him, you might ask? Well, to start, he had a history of crime. Most of it was shoplifting and petty theft. It's a little bit different, isn't it? Stuff that even the judge in those cases referred to as dumb kid stuff. Even if the crimes started small, he had turned into a serial wife-beater. There was also the history of animal abuse. something that James testified to despite not having any evidence to substantiate it. The only alleged evidence of this was a single rumor from a neighbor who claimed Cameron bragged about killing a dog. But that seems to be an isolated incident with no context and nothing to corroborate the story. Then it shouldn't be in a fucking courtroom, should it, Judge? And since we've already talked about the phenomenon where people change their stories once a person officially becomes a suspect, the context of that story, assuming Cameron even said such a thing, would really matter. For example, I've stated on numerous occasions that I could kill a coyote. My town is full of them, and when I walk at night, I'll occasionally encounter one. I've been asked if I'm not afraid to walk at night because of the coyotes, and my answer has always been that I'm not, because if one of them attacked me, I would win that fight. That's not to say that I want to kill a coyote, nor would I be so confident in my odds if I was attacked by multiple of them at once. But if I had to fight one of my town's coyotes one-on-one, that thing is going down.
It's just a coyote.
I know coyotes are a thing in America. I've never really seen a coyote. I guess it must be quite small, more cat-like rather than tiger-like. I know they get dogs, right? They kill dogs. People are worried about their dogs getting killed by coyotes. Now imagine you found out that I was accused of murder and alleged to be a sociopath. Someone who'd heard my explanation of why I'm not afraid to do my exercise at night instead of during the day might remember that story and say, man, Kevin sure did talk about killing coyotes a lot. And don't even get me started on how Simon's advocacy for dog genocide would look at trial. That's why it would be important to know what, if anything, Cameron had actually said in reference to dogs. Regardless, there was still no evidence that he ever actually did kill animals. Regardless, but you know what there was real evidence of? His love of satanic-type activities. Like listening to Iron Maiden or whatever it was. That's right, a certified psychiatrist took the stand in Cameron's trial and called him a Satanist and a cultist because he had Iron Maiden and Led Zeppelin posters. Was this the 80s, the 90s? The Satanic Panic, when was that? This is so fucked up. And because he had a tattoo of a skull on his shoulder, which may have been the most generic shoulder tattoo possible for a man in 1991. It's insane to me that a jury would have found James's analysis of Cameron as a sociopath based on heavy metal and tattoos to be credible, but this was also in Texas at the height of the Satanic Panic, there we go, so maybe I shouldn't find it as unbelievable as I do. The marriage counsellor that had been brought onto the case agreed with James's analysis as well. Brilliant. That brings us to the other key witness. I get the feeling they might not actually be a witness. They might be a witness like these other two guys are witnesses. I mean, yeah, sure, they're witnesses because they're in court, but I mean, Jesus Christ. What the f***? That's Johnny Webb. Johnny had been locked up in the same facility as Cameron while he awaited trial, and according to Johnny, Cameron confessed to setting the fire, and the alleged story was that Stacy had accidentally injured or killed one of the girls the night before, and Cameron had set the fire to cover up the incident. Is Johnny here just doing this because he hopes to get some leniency on his sentence or something? This is not reliable. It's also just hearsay, no? However, the coroner reports showed that the girls had no signs of abuse or injuries other than their burns. It was also very strange that Cameron, who had maintained his innocence to everybody he spoke to, would confess murder to a stranger, especially a stranger in prison where child killers not exactly popular. Yeah, it's nonsense. This is another witness who is not a witness. Stacy also took the stand during the trial, and she maintained Cameron's innocence as well. However, when questioned about the meaning behind his tattoos, she struggled to come up with an answer. Honestly, it seemed like she struggled to understand the question, which was a reasonable reaction to have because it was just a regular tattoo that he got because he thought it looked cool. But her inability to ascribe some deep meaning to Cameron's tattoos appeared to hurt her credibility, like she had something to hide. Oh my god, this is absurd. Or maybe like she was confused because it was a stupid question to ask in the first place. Indeed. Cameron had wanted to take the stand himself, but his lawyers advised against it, thinking that it'd make a bad witness. In fact, the defense only called a single witness, which was Willingham's babysitter. The babysitter said Cameron was a nice guy, and that she didn't think that he would hurt his children. And that was the entirety of the defense. Well, defense, how about you dismantle all of the arguments from the prosecution, which are insane? It seems like I could do a better job at this.
And the truth shall set you free!
It took barely an hour for the jury to deliberate. Cameron was found guilty and sentenced to death. For nearly a decade, there were no new developments. Yeah, there's not a situation here, like Kevin said at the beginning, there's not really a way where it's like, oh yeah, new DNA evidence came along or something. It's just, there wasn't a crime. Stacy and a few others stood by their belief that Cameron was innocent, but most people just accepted his guilt. Even though she believed Cameron was innocent, Stacey divorced him a year after his conviction. She may not have thought he was a killer, but even by his own admission, he was a pretty husband. Yeah, fine. There's a difference between being a husband and being a triple murderer of your own children, right? The years passed, and Cameron stayed locked up in prison with no visitors aside from his parents, who drove down once a month to see him. Something interesting happened in 1995, though. Something which should have, but didn't result in this case being revisited. What could it be? Maybe the Dr. Death guy or the arson investigator got completely discredited or something, which should cause something to relook at it, like something with the witnesses, perhaps. I mentioned the suspiciously high rate of death sentence convictions in cases utilizing Dr. Death indeed, and the identical language he used to describe every defendant. Ugh, guy, come on. Most importantly, he had testified that every single person had a 100% chance of committing violent crimes again. In the late 80s, there had been an investigation into this claim, and it turned out that James was more than a little off with his assessments. The convicts that were behind bars, thanks to James's testimony, were almost entirely model prisoners, staying out of trouble and not getting into fights. And out of the 12 paroled convicts that the investigation was able to talk to, only one had reoffended. Okay, we need to ignore everything that guy says. Eventually, James fell under fire, being labelled a quack by the rest of the psychiatric community. And indeed, that would be my opinion of him, allegedly, and just an opinion. And in 1995, he was finally expelled from the American Psychiatric Association and the Texas Society of Psychiatric Physicians. I'd think that would force the state to re-examine any case that James had been a part of, but apparently it did not. In fact, he continued to testify on 57 more cases after losing his accreditation. Apparently, the DAs in Texas were eager to have a psychiatrist who would say exactly what they wanted to hear and didn't care if the guy was a complete charlatan. The real drama didn't begin until 1999, when playwright Elizabeth Gilbert began writing to Cameron in prison. And for anyone wondering, no, this is not the same as Elizabeth Gilbert, who wrote Eat, Pray, Love. I wasn't wondering, I didn't know who wrote that book. Anyway, a friend who worked at an organization advocating against the death penalty had recommended that Elizabeth became a pen pal to a death row inmate, and she decided, well, why not? She gave her friend a mailing address, and shortly after, she received a letter from Cameron. It was just a friendly introduction letter saying she was welcome to write back or that she could visit him if she wanted. And for whatever reason, she decided to go and visit the prison, because humans are naturally curious creatures. They spoke for about 2 hours, and they continued to correspond afterwards. Elizabeth even made a second visit to the prison to see Cameron. She had assumed this entire time that he was guilty, despite his insistence to the contrary, as you would. But at the same time, he didn't seem like a killer. He was kind and polite, and his letters were very introspective. He was open about hitting Stacey and being a terrible husband, but maintained that he had loved his children above all else, and that having children had finally made him start acting like a man. Yeah, I agree, he was a pretty guy at the beginning, but he did seem like, I'm always saying, like, if your relationship's not working, don't have kids, it's not going to fix it. Maybe a rare example of that actually working here. Still, I stand by my point. Probably not going to fix things. Even though she believed he was guilty, Elizabeth decided to visit the courthouse in Corsicana and asked to see the public records from Cameron's case. It didn't take her long for her to start seeing that things didn't line up. Yes, I imagine because she has a brain. She saw the pattern of witnesses changing their testimony after Cameron had become a suspect, and saw that witnesses' statements were contradictory, sometimes with people talking about things that happened when they weren't even there. For example, after Cameron's arrest, Diane Barbie claimed that he had made no attempt. Wait, Diane Barbie's a dude? Or is that a typo? I think it's a typo, right? Diane is not a dude's name. That she had made no attempt to get into the house and rescue... Oh, I'm sorry. Claimed that he, as in Cameron. It's been a long day. I apologize. It's really obvious in retrospect. Sorry, Kevin.
I still love you.
That he had made no attempt to get into the house and rescue his kids until the firefighters had already arrived, after which he seemed to be putting on a show of it. But she wasn't actually there for most of the time. She'd gone back home to call the fire department. Buffy, on the other hand, had stayed at the Willingham's house, and she saw Cameron breaking windows to get to the girl's bedroom to try and get inside. Elizabeth began tracking people down to talk to them about the case. Most people believed Cameron was guilty, but not everyone was convinced. She spoke to the aforementioned judge that referred to Cameron's crimes as dumb kid stuff, and the judge was unconvinced of Cameron's guilt. She also spoke to his former parole officer, who said, quote, "He was probably one of my favourite kids. Months before the fire, he'd even visited her office, despite no longer being on parole, just to show off pictures of Stacey and his kids, to let her know how much better he was doing, than when he was a teenage punk. This is... oh, no. What had begun as mere curiosity had turned into a quest to find the truth. And that truth, Elizabeth now believed, was that Cameron was innocent. He also got a new court-appointed lawyer, one that actually wanted to help him, but he lacked the resources to hire experts. Oh, okay, you got to pay for your... like, you get a court-appointed lawyer, but you can't pay for your own... You have to pay for your own experts. Oh, that sucks. I didn't even think about that. Elizabeth tried working with Cameron's new lawyer to provide information, but they couldn't come up with anything exculpatory. The case went through the appeals process all the way to the US Supreme Court, who declined to hear the case, but the conviction was upheld. Then in December 2003, Cameron finally received the letter he'd been dreading for the past 12 years. His execution was set for 6 p.m. on February the 17th, just 2 months away. In January, Elizabeth found the name of Dr. Gerald Hurst. Gerald was a renowned chemist and inventor who studied at the University of Cambridge before eventually settling in Texas. It was quite the jump. Most of his inventions involved explosives meant for war, but he also invented the Mylar balloon, so that's neat. Okay. But in 1996, he began advising on arson cases. According to the magazine Texas Monthly, Hearst's forays into arson investigations were the moments when fire investigation began to emerge out of the dark age of hunches, untested hand-me-down arson indicators, and wives' tales. Okay, so it was kind of basically a pseudoscience before, and this guy's like, how about we science the shit out of this and actually make it into something useful? Good. I like you already, Dr. Hurst. You see, up until this point, arson investigations were just a collection of folksy wisdom being utilized by people with minimal education and training. Oh. Even though everything I described from the initial investigation sounded scientific, it was anything but. Yeah, I was like, this doesn't sound so shoddy. But it was shoddy, it's just dressed up as looking good, right? Gerald agreed to take a look at the evidence that had been presented in Cameron's case, and he immediately ripped it to shreds. Let's fucking go. To start, there was the brown residue they claimed was evidence of a liquid accelerant. As it turns out, that's not a thing that happens. Accelerants don't leave any sort of residue like that. And of all the samples that were taken from the house for testing, there was only a single sample which had tested positive for any sort of accelerant, and that had been taken from the porch. As Gerald noted, there was a charcoal grill on the porch, so it would have been weirder if they didn't find charcoal lighter fluid in that area. Yeah. There also was the supposed pentagram burned into the floor. You know, the one that very much wasn't there unless you squint really hard and tilt your head funny. Gerald noted that the supposed 5 tips of the pentagram lined up with where the 5 windows in the room were, suggesting the pattern could have been caused by the influx of oxygen to the room after it had gotten hot enough to blow out the windows. Also, it's not a fucking pentagram. That just left the paw patterns on the floor, the telltale sign of arson that had been used in countless cases for decades. The only problem with this is that they weren't a telltale sign of arson, and Manuel, the original investigator, should have been well aware of that thanks to the famous Lime Street fire that occurred a year before the fire at Willingham's home. The Lime Street fire took place in Jacksonville, Florida in October of 1990. Gerald Lewis escaped from his house with his 3-year-old son, while 2 women and 4 children burned to death inside. Lewis was originally charged with arson and murder, but the investigators in that case decided to perform a little experiment. There was a nearly identical house nearby, one that was abandoned. The arson investigators decided to set a fire in that house without using any accelerants just to see what happened, and the results changed everything. That's what happens when you get good experts that you pay a lot of money for, I reckon. When a room is on fire, things burn upwards, and smoke and heat accumulate at the top of the room. As the temperature in the room rises, objects in the room start to undergo pyrolysis, I think. This is when solid objects begin to break down and release gases as a result of high temperatures. The ambient temperature eventually reaches the combustion point of those gases, and the room experiences what's called a flashover. A flashover is when all combustible matter in a room simultaneously ignites, even things like carpets that had previously been nowhere near the flames. Whoa! I had no idea that's a thing. That's crazy. This was a phenomenon that was known to exist, but apparently it hadn't been studied very intently, or possibly at all. It was believed that it would take a minimum of 15 to 20 minutes for flashover to occur in a burning room, and that the only way a room could fully ignite faster than that was with the use of accelerants. But in the experiment following the Lime Street fire, it barely took 4 minutes for flashover to occur. More importantly, every single thing that had been considered a telltale sign of arson was present in the house they burned without using an accelerant, including pore patterns. Okay, this was like, it was just, like the blood spatter or whatever, the dental things that are like considered good evidence, and then they're kind of disproven as pseudoscience. And it seems like the way they did arson investigation before seemed to be pretty fucking unscientific. Manuel had laid out 20 markers of arson, and Gerald went through and systematically refuted them one by one. He concluded that the original investigation was based on outdated and debunked ideas, and that the fire in the Willingham's house was definitely not arson. He wrote, quote, "The whole case was based on the purest form of junk science. There was no item of evidence that indicated arson." Gerald compiled his report and sent it to Texas Governor Rick Perry's office, as well as to the Board of Pardon and Paroles. 4 days before his execution date, Cameron finally received a call from his attorney. The board had denied his petition, and Governor Perry didn't respond to the report. That is not... No! On February the 17th, he was executed by lethal injection. Fuck this! Oh my god, no! I did not expect it to go that way. What the hell? Stacey was in attendance even though she proclaimed his innocence for over a decade and had petitioned the previous governor for clemency. Shortly before the execution, Stacey changed her position and decided that Cameron was guilty. This was based on an alleged confession he gave to her, though the deals of that confession, as presented by Stacey, were inconsistent with the details of the case. That's a weird twist. Cameron's last words before he was executed were not recorded by the state on account of being too vulgar, but it was something along the lines of telling Stacey to go f*** herself and burning hell. The string of profanity was so long that they had to begin the execution just to make him stop talking. Since the execution, additional information has come out with regards to Johnny, the prison informant. In 2000, he recanted his testimony, though this information was never shared with Cameron's lawyers. He then recanted, having recanted, and that's weird. However, before he originally recanted, he wrote a letter to the prosecutor threatening to do so. Even though the prosecutor had denied making any sort of deal with Johnny in exchange for his testimony, it turned out that was not the case. How is that allowed? Johnny had threatened to recant if the prosecutor didn't get him out of prison. He was currently locked up for robbery, and since he didn't get out, he made good on that threat. Correspondence between Johnny and the prosecutor was discovered that clearly showed there had been a deal in place, and the prosecutor was claiming in the letters to be trying to get Johnny out of prison early. After recanting, Johnny must have received some token of assurance that he would get out of prison, causing him to go back to his original story. Then in 2009, Johnny gave an interview to the Innocence Project in which he said, quote, "My memory is in bits and pieces. I was on a lot of medication at the time. Everyone knew that." After a pause, he continued, "The statute of limitations has run out on perjury, hasn't it?" In 2014, he again recanted his testimony about Cameron confessing to him. Needless to say, this entire case was a massive show. There was an alleged corrupt prosecutor utilizing an incompetent arson investigator and jailhouse snitch who allegedly was told to lie in court. Yeah, and there's also the Dr. Death guy. I do need to note that in 2017 the prosecutor was charged for his alleged misconduct, but was acquitted. There are few people who will argue that this case was a horrific miscarriage of justice, though questions over Cameron's guilt still remain for some. Why are people arguing this is a horrific miscarriage of justice? All of the original evidence was completely dismantled, and you still stuck a needle in his arm. To some people, this was the case of a guilty person who was tried and convicted based on pseudoscientific nonsense that should have never met the standards of the death penalty. But to most, Cameron was an innocent person sentenced to death for a crime that nobody committed because it was just an accidental fire caused by a space heater. Christ. Ryan Waller. Our final story today takes us back to Christmas 2006 in Phoenix, Arizona. It was on that day that Ryan Waller failed to show up to dinner with his family. About 8 months earlier, 18-year-old Ryan had been dating a girl named Heather Kwan. From what I can gather, the two had known each other for a few years and originally met while both were attending Mountain Ridge High School. Part of that is based on a statement made by Ryan, though, so it might not be accurate. For reasons that will become apparent. Well, can't you just... School records, not a thing? But regardless of how long they had known one another, their relationship started right around Heather's 21st birthday in 2006. After Ryan graduated high school, the couple moved into an apartment together. Heather spent a couple of years in community college, but she was now attending Arizona State University with ambitions of becoming a defense lawyer. She was known for always putting others first and doing what she could to help those in need, such as volunteering for the Big Brothers Big Sisters program. As for Ryan, he was trying to pursue a career in the music industry. He loved playing guitar and had been playing for years. Around the time he was 11, Ryan's father noted that Ryan was able to play any song he heard on his guitar, so it only made sense to try giving him a career in music and see what happened. I don't know if studying music in college was going to be part of this plan or not, but if so, Ryan was taking a gap year. But rent can be expensive, especially for a recent high school graduate and college student, so the couple shared the apartment with a roommate named Alicia. I wish there was more I could tell you about Ryan and Heather, but there's very little information about their lives up until that point, and much of the information out there is inconsistent and unreliable. That brings us to Christmas, though, when Ryan and Heather didn't show up for Christmas dinner with Ryan's family. It was unusual for them not to show up, and Ryan didn't answer the phone when his parents tried calling. Worried, they decided to go to the apartment and see if everything was okay. There was no answer when they knocked at the door, so Ryan's father called the police a little before 8 p.m. to request a wellness check. And then they waited. And waited. For hours. At one point, Ryan's parents left the house to go get some coffee, but this happened during the most inopportune time. During the 10 to 15 minutes that the Wallers were gone, Alicia returned home to the apartment. She let herself in, locked the door behind her, and went straight to her room. Okay. The Wallers returned with their coffee and continued waiting, completely unaware that Alicia was now home inside the apartment. Okay. At around 11:30, so almost 4 hours later, Ryan's father received a call from the police to let them know that somebody was finally on their way to do the wellness check, and that the officers would be there around midnight. When the police finally arrived, they knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Alicia had heard the knock, but she just ignored it, assuming Ryan would get the door. It's unclear if she had seen Ryan or Heather in the apartment and just didn't notice anything was wrong, or if she was just operating on the assumption that it was midnight, so surely Ryan would be home by now. Either way, nobody opened the door for the police. The living room in the apartment had vertical blinds that were moving back and forth slightly from a rotating fan inside the room. Remember, it may have been Christmas, but this was still Arizona, so it was definitely hot enough to need a fan. Wait, where's Arizona? It's hot on Christmas? That sounds nice. Anyway, one of the officers shined his flashlight between the blinds, trying to get a peek inside the room, at which point he said he saw a body. The officer made the Wallers move away from the house, but the police didn't go inside yet. Instead, they called to get a search warrant. And if that sounds strange to you, well, you'd be correct. Yeah, can't police go in if they have, probable cause? Or, if there's a body in there, smash down the door. I mean, you could be saving someone's life. Now, in general, police do need a warrant to enter your home. It's a good thing. But there are exceptions for exigent circumstances. A police officer seeing a person in such a state that the officer would only refer to the person as a body certainly qualifies as exigent circumstances, especially since they only saw one body in an apartment with 3 residents, meaning there was no way to know what state the other 2 people were in and if they needed immediate assistance. Yeah, obviously, bust that fucking door down and get in there, officer. After almost an hour of waiting, a warrant was issued and someone came down from the station to pick the locks to the house. According to Ryan's father, at this point, there were about 10 cop cars at the apartment and a helicopter overhead. Oh, shit. The attempts to pick the lock on the front door failed, so the police went around back to try the 2 back doors. There was also a sliding door that led to the kitchen and another door that led straight to the master bedroom. The noise from trying to pick the locks finally got someone's attention, and either Ryan or Alicia answered the door. There are conflicting reports on which one opened the door, but it was probably Ryan. Don't we have statements from officers who, were there? Yeah, someone's dead, right? Once the doors were opened, Ryan was handcuffed and placed in the back of a cop car. At this point, it was about 1 a.m., over 5 hours after Ryan's parents had originally called the police. His parents could see that he had a black eye, but they were not allowed to talk to him or approach the cop car where he was being held. The apartment was then cordoned off with police tape. Firefighters and DMTs had entered the apartment as well, but they left after a few minutes without anyone else with them. This led Ryan's parents to believe that whatever was going on, everyone was fine at least. The EMTs hadn't taken anyone out in an ambulance, and they hadn't been called over to check on Ryan. Well, if the EMTs aren't taking anyone out in an ambulance, it means that they're either fine or dead. It was unclear to them why their son was being put in the back of a cruiser, but his black eye must have been superficial if he wasn't being attended to at all. What Ryan's parents were unaware of was that Heather was dead in the apartment, and Ryan was being taken into custody as the obvious murder suspect, which does make sense since it's usually the boyfriend or the husband. Yeah, completely fair. The next 4 hours are largely unaccounted for. Suffice to say that Ryan was just seated in the back of the police car. There's no record of anything that happened beyond him just waiting there until a little after 5 a.m. when he was taken into a police interrogation room. Ryan was left alone in the room for roughly 10 minutes before the interrogation began. There was a pair of handcuffs attached to the table, and after about 3.5 minutes, he handcuffed his left hand to the table. He then spent several more minutes fidgeting and making whining and groaning noises. 9 minutes into his wait, he stood up and attempted to pace around the room, only for the handcuffs to prevent him from walking, so he sat down and picked up a piece of paper on the table to read, after which Detective Paul Dalton and another officer entered the room. Why did he handcuff himself to the table? Anyway, now if anyone had been watching the CCTV footage of Ryan in the interrogation room, his behaviour should have seemed extremely strange. To be fair, I wouldn't expect the police to have someone in an office watching live feeds of all the interrogation rooms, but Ryan's actions, while he was left alone, were still weird. Why would someone voluntarily handcuff themselves to the table, right? Also, when he tried to walk and then was unable to because of the handcuffs, he looked genuinely confused by the discovery. Something's not right upstairs. It was strange, but the police hadn't seen any of this, and I don't think there's a reasonable expectation that they should have. No, fair enough. You don't have to monitor. Someone in the interrogation room, surely there's someone sitting there with a bank of cameras being like, making sure they're okay. Isn't that the point of the cameras? No, maybe not. Maybe it's to record the conversations and such things. Of course, there was still the fact that he had handcuffed himself to the table, even if nobody saw him do it. That's something I would think that Paul would have found strange. It's like, did you do this yourself, mate?
Well, why am I cuffed?
But he also may have just assumed that whoever brought Ryan into the room initially had cuffed him. Anyway, the next 10 minutes were mostly spent with the second officer in the room taking photos of Ryan's injuries and a seemingly unnecessary amount of pictures of his feet. Well, maybe they just had a thing for old Ryan's feet right there. However, something important happened at the beginning of the process. Ryan said that he wanted to sleep, something he would say like 100 times over the course of the interrogation, and he asked if he could go home. Has he been drugged? Or has he taken drugs? Paul told him that he should go to the hospital, and if he had a concussion, a doctor would tell him not to sleep anyway. I think that's a legend, right? I'm pretty sure. I think I made a video about this back in the day, that if someone has a concussion, you're like, don't go to sleep, don't go to sleep. It's okay. It doesn't make a difference. Don't take that as medical advice. I think that's true, though. To be clear, the idea that a person with a concussion needs to be kept awake is a myth. Kevin and I, same page, same giant brains. I mean, we don't literally have the same brain, but I believe Kevin's brain is extremely giant.
Oh, am I?
But the fact that I knew that as well, maybe, just saying, maybe I also have a giant brain. Sorry, I'll stop rambling. I'm having a beer. It's late in the day, and this has been an extremely long episode, and I have a fridge full of beers at work. I'm having one, because my car's having its winter tires put on today, so I had to take a taxi, an Uber to work. So I'm going home by Uber. I'm like, f*** it. I'm having a beer. It's an IPA. It's very good. Jesus Christ, is this 6.5%? Holy okay, we're not messing around today, boys. Sleep is really important for helping brain injuries heal, though a doctor may request that someone wake up the person every couple of hours just to ask them basic questions and see if there are any negative changes in their cognitive abilities. That's not the important part, though. The important part was that Paul recognized that Ryan's face looked really bad and that he should see a doctor, something that he no longer seemed concerned with once the interrogation began. After 20 minutes in the interrogation room, it's time for the actual interrogation to begin. Okay, Paul introduced himself, then prepared to Mirandize Ryan. He did so by asking Ryan if he'd ever seen the show Cops or CSI, to which Ryan replied, no. Paul was in disbelief at this and asked again.
Really?
Dude, maybe he just doesn't watch the same shows as you. If you asked him about CSI, he'd be like, which one? Because I've seen them all. I haven't. I've seen Las Vegas, Miami, New York. Las Vegas, I believe, in its entirety. Miami, probably in its entirety. I don't think New York in its entirety. There are other ones, I'm sure. But I was big into that back in the day. Probably why I quite like doing a true crime show. It's just like episodes of CSI, except the cops are often not very competent. He then asked again, expanding the question to any police shows, legal shows, or any shows at all, to which he finally got a yes. He then read Ryan his rights so that he could begin the interrogation. And right from the start, things were not going well. The first question Paul asked was, what's the highest grade you completed? That's a very innocuous question, not the sort of thing that anyone would have a reason to lie about, but Ryan's answer was, I don't know. Ryan is on drugs, or Ryan is having a mental episode of some variety. After multiple more attempts, Ryan answered that the highest grade he completed was 8, that he graduated. He didn't know if he had a GED. That's what you get when you graduate high school, right, Americans? and that he did not graduate. That was undoubtedly a frustrating start to the interrogation, so Paul tried to start from scratch and asked again what the highest grade Ryan completed was. This time his answer was, I don't know, B. like a grade for a paper. It's worth noting that Ryan's speech sounded a bit slurred and slow at times, probably like my speech will sound after I finish this pint of 6.5% IPA, which is delicious, by the way. I should do this more often.
Say that again.
I said, that's right.
In addition to not really making any sense. But to Paul, this was likely just a guilty person putting on some sort of show. This isn't a very good show. This is a really bizarre show. The theory he was operating under was that there was some sort of violent domestic dispute that resulted in Ryan getting a black eye before shooting and killing Heather. I mean, yeah, okay, fine, it's always the husband, but, like, you're gonna need some evidence, my dude. Also, he's clearly not right. He needs to see a doctor. That was the theory going in, and Paul wanted to ask questions to find out what happened, hopefully leading to a confession. With questions about Ryan's education not getting anywhere, Paul began asking about Heather. This was equally frustrating at first. Ryan first said he didn't have a girlfriend and seemed mildly confused about which Heather he was being asked about. He also claimed that Heather was 16 or 17 years old, something that Paul was apparently unaware was factually incorrect. After being asked how they met, Ryan said that he'd known her from school. He then said, she used to be a business name. I don't know. She used to be in my book named with business name. Bro, he's got something going on. This is very strange. She used to be a business name. What's that mean? At this point, I'd like to think that would be a massive red flag for the detective. Almost 20 minutes earlier, Paul had said that Ryan should see a doctor and indicated that he might have suffered a concussion, and that the complete word salad coming out of Ryan's mouth supported that hypothesis. She used to be a business name. Okay. She used to be Walmart. Ryan may have been suffering from aphasia, which is a condition that most commonly occurs during strokes or from traumatic brain injuries. There are different ways it can present, but a person with aphasia may say total nonsense with no recognition that the words coming out of their mouth are not the words they're trying to say. I know about word salad because I'm a big fan of the show Boston Legal. And, I mean, it's an old show now, but I'm still a big fan. I watched some episodes recently. And one of the main characters on their show gets word salad sometimes.
Your Honor, I refer you to Plaintiff's Exhibit Number Apple.
I beg your pardon?
Apple trash can is picked from God.
Huh?
But instead of taking this into account, Paul pressed forward, interpreting this as Ryan and Heather having been in the same business class together. Right, from she used to be a business name. I don't know, she used to be in my book named with business name. This dude's, something's wrong with his brain. He began asking about Ryan's eye and what happened. Ryan claimed that Heather hit him by accident, but that answer didn't satisfy Paul. He kept pressing, asking what he did that would make Heather hit him. Ryan replied, she just hit me on accident. She was giving Christina head. Okie dokie. Who's Christina? Wait, the girl who lives with us isn't called Christina, right? It was a shorter name. I don't remember what the name was. Anyway.
Alicia.
That was an unexpected answer, so when Paul asked him to repeat it, Ryan said she was helping Christina with her hair or something. I don't know. To be clear, I have no idea who Christina is, or if Ryan even knew a person with that name. Okay. She was giving Christina head. All right then, mate. Okay. The interrogation continued for another 10 minutes or so, with Paul not getting anywhere in his questioning. Ryan had said that he didn't have a girlfriend, that Heather was his girlfriend, that Heather was Eric's girlfriend, much like with Christina, it's unclear if there even is an Eric, and then said Alicia had hit him. Though first, he said that he didn't even know who Alicia was, and throughout all of that, he just kept saying repeatedly that he wanted to go to sleep. Bro is concussed. Now look, I can understand a police officer thinking that this was an uncooperative suspect or something, but only up to a certain point. He was lying about things that there would be no reason to lie about. His story was incoherent and inconsistent with itself, and he put together multiple strings of words that were not sentences. Oh yes, and his face was pretty badly f***ed up. I'd really like to think that it was clear something was wrong with Ryan, but Paul disagreed. I guess that's what happens when detectives make up their minds about what happens before an interrogation. Why would you be making up your mind already? You've really got nothing to go on. Since he wasn't getting anywhere, Paul decided to be more direct and tell Ryan that there was a dead girl in the apartment. This information seemed to shock Ryan into a slightly more coherent state momentarily, though he was still struggling with his words. Upon being told that Heather was dead, Ryan explained that someone named Richie and his dad had tried to break into the house with shooting arrow, bow, and darts. He said that they hit him and Heather with those, and that was all he remembered because after that, all he wanted to do was go to sleep. What is happening? Aside from the fact that he was introducing even more characters into this story, Ryan was finally saying something that started to construct a coherent narrative. Upon further questioning, he corrected himself and said that Richie and his dad had 2 revolvers. Very different from a shooting bow and arrow and darts. So they shot him in the eye, and then they shot Heather on the couch, though he didn't see that happen because he was already on the ground passing out. He didn't get shot in the eye, he got a black eye, so they must have pistol whipped him or something. Even though a story was starting to form, Paul was only getting angrier and more frustrated with Ryan. When Ryan said they each had 2 revolvers and they didn't laugh any shells, Paul got annoyed at the fact that the story had changed from having bows and arrows, having guns. He seemed unconcerned with the fact that Ryan, who looked like he had been shot in the face, was having trouble forming sentences. Oh my god. Wait, has he been shot? Has he actually been shot? And it's, oh my god, is this one of those cases where he's been shot and a bullet has lodged in his brain? Like someone shot him in the, because he said he was shot in the eye, right? What if he was shot in the eye and it went like transorbital and went out the back and into his brain, and that's what's made him wonky? Oh my god, get him into those machines to scan the brain. He flat out claimed not to believe Ryan's story, stating that if Ryan had been shot in the eye, like he claimed, that he wouldn't be talking, he'd be dead. Ryan replied, "That's what I thought too, man. I don't know." He also claimed to have been put in either a sleeping hold or sleepy hold at some point, a phrase that really seemed to agitate Paul. Paul was unable to figure out, he's interviewing a guy with a bullet in his head, right? Is that really what's happening? Oh my god, has he actually been shot in the face? And he's survived. Oh man. Paul was unable to figure out what the hell a sleepy hold was, which blows my mind. Sure, it's just like putting someone to sleep, sort of, you know. Like a Kevin loves wrestling, there we go. Some sort of wrestling thing. He somehow was able to come to the conclusion that one of the previous word salad statements meant that Ryan and Heather took a business class together, but he didn't assume that Ryan was just talking about a sleeper hold. You're the perfect person to correct me if I'm wrong, Simon, but I'm pretty sure that even people who don't watch wrestling know what a sleeper hold is. Yeah, it's like people, you know, just you get their head in there. It's like, I've been a kid. It's like, yeah, put you to sleep, bro. In case you haven't heard of it, though, it's just a chokehold applied to someone from behind, also known as a rear naked choke. Dude, exactly. Oh, people who are listening to this as a podcast, you don't know what I'm doing. I'm doing the sleeper hold, you know, the classic one. Everyone knows it.
That explains everything.
Anyway, after that, Ryan did his best to answer questions that he didn't know the answers to, but his lack of information continued to piss off the detective. Wait, this is about miscarriages of justice, right? What's the miscarriage of justice here? Is he somehow going to get in trouble for this? And then are they later going to find out he has a bullet in his head this whole time? Where is this going? Is this going somewhere and I just can't tell where it's going because I've had a glass of beer? Am I missing something real obvious now? He didn't really know who Richie was beyond knowing his name, and he had no idea who Ashley was. The latter really seemed to annoy Paul, who was asserting that Ashley was Ryan's roommate. In reality, Paul had forgotten Alicia's name, so he was getting angry at Ryan for his own mistakes. Really? Dude, that's some amateur shit right there. Since he had a new name and his brain needed to create a story for her, Ryan said that Ashley was Richie's father's daughter. Right. He then ascribed that relationship to Heather, which meant that Richie shot his own sister. This was another confusing layer to the story Paul already didn't believe, one that could have been avoided if he had just remembered Alicia's name. Finally, Paul got fed up and asked Ryan why he shot Heather. Ryan insisted that Richie shot him and then shot Heather, and that was all he knew. Paul didn't believe this for a second, but he was 25 minutes into the actual interrogation and getting nowhere. As such, he finally decided to do something that nobody had bothered to do yet. The police were first called a little before 8 p.m. They arrived at Ryan's apartment at midnight, finally got inside at 1 a.m., brought Ryan into an interrogation room after 5 a.m., and kept him there for 45 minutes thus far. So, now, 5 hours after Ryan was taken into custody and 10 hours after the police were originally called, Paul actually looked at Ryan's injuries. Well, good job, mate. Just about time for it. Suddenly, his entire temperament changed as he realized he'd f***ed up in a colossal fashion. Okay, he's been shot in the head, hasn't he? Paul left the room to go and call in the fire department to take a look at Ryan and transport him to the hospital. When he returned, he again tried to figure out the story Ryan was telling as best he could, except that this time, He was actually taking it seriously rather than disregarding it as the ramblings of a murderer trying to get away with his crime. I mean, better late than never, mate, to be honest. He established that Ryan was claiming Richie and his dad broke in and shot them, that he didn't know why they had done it, and that Heather was not related to the perpetrators in any way. When asked if he and Heather had a relationship, Ryan replied, "Not after the shooting, no." Oh my god, Ryan, you're in for a shock when you wake up from your I mean, if you can. I don't know what's going to happen. Poor Ryan, Jesus Christ. Black eye because he got shot around the eye. Whew. It's my speculation currently, but I think we're finally getting there, right? Finally, the fire department came in and they began examining Ryan, with Paul pointing out what he thought were entry and exit wounds for a bullet. Oh wow, it came in and went out? However, even though Ryan's story was finally being taken seriously, there was still no sense of urgency. They calmly looked at Ryan and tried to talk to him, even taking time out to check his blood pressure. That's the sort of thing that could happen on the way to the hospital rather than wasting even more valuable time. It took almost 10 more minutes before they finally took him out of the interrogation room to go to the hospital. So, who were Richie and his dad, and what actually happens here? Richie had used to live in the apartment where Ryan was living, though they'd never been roommates, as is often reported. Wait, how can you be... Oh, okay, sorry, so he was the previous tenant. Right. From what Ryan's father described in an interview, it sounds like Richie moved out at the same time Ryan moved in, so Richie saw that Ryan had a nice guitar and computer and all this stuff. Oh no. Is it really just going to be like a guitar and a computer? That's so depressing. It's so depressing that people do this just for some bull. Not really even work. For a life. Man. This led to Richie conceiving of what could be called the perfect crime. Crime's a lot harder to get away with these days than it was 150 years ago, thanks to things like fingerprints, DNA, and other forensics. However, since Richie had previously lived in that apartment, it would make sense that his fingerprints, DNA, would be all over the place. As long as there were no living witnesses to the crime, he could rob his former apartment with impunity. Yeah, but there's people that... Why are you doing it at night? Just... dude, I don't understand. Why not... Do I agree with him going to rob the place? No. Do I think that if he's going to rob the place, he could do it without killing people? Yes. Just scope the place out, see how many... Spend like a day looking at the house, see where the people come and go, see them coming in and out, and then be like, okay, when they're all out, I go in. Rather than, oh, I need a gun, and I go in and I murder them. Just fuck you. Fuck you, you piece of shit. Allegedly. If this is what happened. Glad I still remember my allegedlys, despite being almost a beer in. It's pretty good. There was even an incident where Richie was in the backyard one night, which may have been to case the joint and see where everything he would want to steal was. When Ryan found him outside, Richie just said that he had a 4-foot iguana that had escaped from the apartment while he was living there and had come to see if he could find it. Assuming the crime took place on Christmas, which we'll get to shortly, it would likely be that Richie and his dad chose to rob the place that day because they assumed everyone would be visiting family. Ignoring the fact that stealing is wrong, robbing an apartment you lived in while nobody is home isn't actually a bad plan to avoid getting caught. The idea to commit indiscriminate murder so as to leave no witnesses while you steal a few $1,000s worth of stuff, however, makes it much f***ing worse. No shit. Especially since shooting Ryan twice he had not actually killed him, despite there being a bullet lodged in his brain throughout the entire ordeal with the police. And thus, I am vindicated. I don't know if I'd be feeling so good about myself if I had this whole beer. And just so we're clear here, it is supposed to be standard procedure to take injured suspects to the hospital before interrogating them. Yeah, but the thing's just got a black eye. Can't blame it for that. It's just a black eye. It's not really injured. It's like you got punched in the face. Seeing as Paul thought Ryan might have had a concussion based on his injuries, he should have been taken to the hospital immediately instead of having his treatment delayed for over 5 hours, plus another hour while the police needlessly waited for a warrant they didn't need. Interrogating a gunshot victim as though he was a murder suspect is already pretty fucked up, but unfortunately the aftermath made things even worse. The reason I kept emphasizing how Ryan's treatment was delayed, because it was so obvious he should have been taken to the hospital before being interrogated, is because by the time he was admitted to hospital, there was an infection from his injury. Yeah, he was shot in the f***ing brain. Ryan needed brain surgery, but they couldn't operate until days later after he was given antibiotics to deal with the infection and reduce the brain swelling, which is remarkable that they can... He got shot twice in the head, and just... I am so rooting for Ryan right now. On the 28th, Ryan finally underwent brain surgery. In addition to the bullet, fragments of broken bone had been lodged in the brain. There was also a splinter from the bullet stuck behind his eye. Although the surgery saved Ryan's life for the time being, he was never the same. He'd lost significant brain function, experienced significant seizures, and lost his left eye. I'm not sure if he lost the actual eye or just the use of it, as he appears to have two eyes in later photos, but it could have been a prosthetic, and I'm just unable to tell the difference. Yeah, prosthetic eyes are pretty good these days. Hell, I wouldn't have known that Columbo had a glass eye unless someone told me. I just thought he was squinty. I mean, I've heard of Columbo, but I couldn't, if someone asked me what does Columbo look like, I wouldn't know. Columbo had a glass eye? Anyway, Ryan spent 35 days in hospital recovering from the initial wounds and then the surgery. And in all that time, the police never came to speak to him, nor did they make any arrests in the case. 3 days after he was released from the hospital, police finally came to talk to him again, though Paul was no longer part of the investigation. 4 days later, Richie Carver was arrested. Excellent. In 2008, he was tried for burglary, aggravated assault, attempted murder. Just attempted? And felony murder. There we go, for the girlfriend, Heather. And he was found guilty on all 4 counts. Excellent. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Brilliant. However, things didn't go nearly as smoothly with regards to Richie's father, Larry Carver. Larry had fled to California immediately after the murders. Bro, fleeing to California is not far enough. You know, it's the United States. They are somewhat united. They will take you from California and put you in Texas. Whereas if you fly to, Belize or something, as we famously say, not Belize, but Lebanon, you got to go live in Lebanon, Larry. Come on. California? They're coming for you, bro.
Perhaps the police will find something.
He was eventually tracked down and arrested, but the case against him wasn't as straightforward as the one against Richie. The only evidence against Larry was Ryan's testimony, which, given his brain damage, the prosecution felt would not be enough for a conviction. There had been one other piece of evidence, testimony from Larry's wife, but this is where things got complicated. Larry's wife originally turned him into the police, saying that he and Richie had left the house on Christmas. Then when they returned, Larry told her that he'd f***ed up and killed 2 people, so he had to run. Get him in prison. That's pretty damning evidence, so long as the jury believed her. But she decided to recant her statement and refused to testify. And thanks to spousal privilege, there was nothing the police could do. Much like how the Fifth Amendment protects a person from being compelled to incriminate themselves, spousal privilege protects a person from being compelled to testify against their spouse. Compelled to testify? So you have to testify? Can't you just be no? Oh, but then you're perjuring yourself. Huh. Never thought about that. But they can't be forced to, save for a couple of narrow exceptions, like if one spouse is the plaintiff and the other is the defendant. With Larry's wife now refusing to testify, the only evidence against him was Ryan's testimony. The prosecution didn't believe his testimony would have been seen as reliable enough to get a conviction, so Larry was set free. Unsurprisingly, Heather's family didn't take kindly to this. They lobbied the state of Arizona to pass new legislation regarding spousal privilege, a bill that became known as Heather's Law. Basically, the new law said that if someone voluntarily gave information to the police about a crime committed by their spouse, there were no takesies-backsies. Yeah, wait. I understand why this rule exists. It's because, you want to be able to have a privileged conversation with your spouse, but that shouldn't mean maybe it should mean. I don't know. I don't know if I like this or not. Because Larry's wife had chosen to come forward to the police and tell them about her husband's confession, she could now be forced to testify in court and repeat what she had told the police. It took until 2012, but Larry finally went to trial and was convicted of murder, burglary, and assault. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole for the murder, plus an additional 21 years for the other crimes to be served concurrently after the end of his natural life. Somewhat awkward phrasing, Kevin says, but it just means that if the life sentence was somehow commuted or overturned, he would still have 21 more years to serve after that. They weren't going to force Larry's corpse to rot in a cell for 21 years after his death, which would be weird and smelly, although I guess it does send quite a powerful message. You're not going to prison for life. You're going for prison for life plus 21 years. You're just going to rot. Although the killers were finally punished for their crimes, this story doesn't have a happy ending. Ryan continued to suffer from seizures for the remainder of his life, and in 2016 he died as a result of those seizures. Oh, I'm sorry, man. That's rubbish. There was an incident where he had a particularly bad seizure in a grocery store that resulted in his head slamming hard against the floor, and it's believed this caused internal bleeding that ultimately led to his death. Because his death was the direct result of injuries back in 2006, this meant that Richie and Larry could now be tried for Ryan's murder, but his parents decided not to bother with the trial since both men were already serving life without parole. But there had been legal action the family wanted to pursue, a lawsuit that took place before Ryan's death. The family sued the Phoenix Police Department for $15 million for their mishandling of the case and the delay in getting Ryan the medical attention that he very visibly needed. Yes, I think that's a fair lawsuit. It would have been interesting to see how this trial would have played out. Unfortunately, that never happened, not because there was some sort of undisclosed settlement either. Instead, 3 weeks before the trial, the judge dismissed the case with prejudice, citing a lack of evidence of any wrongdoing on the part of Paul or the police department. Bro, he'd been shot in the head twice. He was very unwell, clearly. What the fuck? Prejudice means you can't try again, right? So how exactly did the judge come to this conclusion? There were two things that seemed to exonerate the police. First were the results of their own internal investigation, which found that there was nothing abnormal or untoward that happened in Ryan's case. I'd like to think that when a police department is sued for misconduct, that their own internal investigation would carry little to no weight. But apparently, that's an incredibly naive thing for me to believe. Yeah, you would think, wouldn't you, Kevster? The other thing the police offered was testimony from some sort of expert brain doctor, though the name and exact specialty of the expert witnesses aren't available anyway, so I don't know exactly what type of doctor they were. Maybe they were a love doctor.
My heart soars.
Regardless, the expert concluded that the 6-hour delay in Ryan's treatment caused by the police would not have had any meaningful impact on Ryan's eventual outcome. It's still behavior by the police, though. For most people, that sounds like a wild and honestly pretty insane comment. It doesn't to me. He got shot in the head. Like, I don't know what they did to him in the hospital, particularly afterwards, but they didn't remove the bullet, did they? They left it in there. Did they leave it in there? I don't remember. Honestly, this is the next day. I recorded that bit yesterday. But it doesn't sound that insane to me. If you've been trained in any sort of first aid that's more elaborate than putting a band-aid on someone, I have been, you're probably aware that every second counts when it comes to head trauma or possible brain damage. Right, but he's been shot in the head. What are they going to do? 6 hours is a lot of seconds, 21,600 of them to be precise, and we've all been taught that every one of those matters when you're treating this kind of injury. So how could a supposed expert possibly argue otherwise? Well, Ryan and Heather were discovered on Christmas, but what if that wasn't the day they were shot? What if they'd actually been shot on December 23rd? There's no reason to think that was the case, but that's when the police had officially declared that the shooting took place. Okay. It has been speculated that they may have altered the timeline to absolve themselves of any responsibility in the matter, because if Ryan had already been like that for 2 days, then the chances are the damage was already done, and the infection would have had time to set in anyway. Oh, I'm sorry, he did get an infection, didn't he? Was that because they didn't get in there fast enough? In that case, I'm sorry, I just forgot about that because it was yesterday. Fuck that. They need their 15 mil. It doesn't even seem that greedy, to be honest. Of course, this ignores the fact that Larry's wife said it happened on Christmas. It also ignores the fact that Alicia would have been living with a dead body on her couch for 2 days. And what, she just didn't notice? This is almost more egregious than the fuck-up in the first place. This cover-up. This should, one is procedural error, bad procedural error. This is corruption. This should be punished much more severely. I can understand her coming home at 9 or 10 on Christmas evening to an apartment with no lights on and just going up to her room without seeing Heather's body. That's entirely believable. But for Alicia to have spent 2 full days living in that apartment without seeing Heather's body on the couch or seeing the state Ryan was in, I just don't buy that as being possible. Also, when Ryan was being interrogated, there were more injuries than just the black and swollen eye. There was a chunk missing from his nose, one that Paul had actually brought up during interrogation. However, the wound still looked fresh, like liquid could pour out of it at any moment. If that had happened days earlier, it should have looked more dried and probably scabbed over. Yeah. Honestly, I can't find any reason to believe that the shootings took place on the 23rd instead of Christmas, but that information was what the expert witness was working with. Well, this is so fucked up. And if that were the case, then sure, I could see an expert believing that Ryan was already fucked by the time they'd found him, so a few more hours would have led to a better outcome. Of course, the very claim that Ryan and Heather were shot on the 23rd was brought up in the lawsuit as an example of the police department trying to cover up how much they mismanaged the case. So the expert should have been aware that there was at least the possibility that the shootings took place on Christmas. This is fucked up. If I were those parents, I would be fucking pissed. I would take this to the highest court in the land. or whatever is next, because this is outrageous. I've seen reports that the Department of Justice opened an investigation into the police department's conduct. Excellent. But there are no updates regarding what, if anything, has happened with that. Not excellent. So to date, there has been no accountability for the police that treated a gunshot victim as if he was a murderer, and Paul has since retired with his reputation intact. Okay, look, I get Paul f***ed up, but then the cover-up? That really pisses me off. I'm sure we'd all like to think that miscarriages of justice like these are few and far between, and that the cases we've discussed today are the exception rather than the rule. The unfortunate reality is that studies suggest 1 in 20 people in American prisons are actually innocent. Oh my god, with some experts claiming that the real number is probably 1 in 10. This would suck. This is like one of those things. I'm not a criminal. I don't imagine myself committing any crimes, but to be swept up in something and have to go to prison and being innocent would be fucking terrible. Going to prison for something you did is going to be terrible. Going to prison for something you didn't do? The system is designed to protect police who force false confessions out of suspects, and there's a lot of incentive for innocent people to plead guilty to crimes to avoid trial, particularly for people who can't afford to hire their own attorney. Until the American legal system undergoes some sort of massive overhaul, this is unlikely to change anytime soon. I can't tell you how the legal system should be changed, but fortunately, it's not my job to figure that sort of out. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go to Polymarket and place my wager on how many times Simon will scream, "Police, what are you doing?" during this episode. It was many, Kevin. It was many. This was a very long episode, Kevin. Thank you for writing it. Thank you, dear audience, for being here. And some people have pointed out the drab background and the slightly less than good lighting. I am in the process of setting up a new studio. The other studios are looking pretty good. This is the last one on my to-do list. So this is completely irrelevant for anyone listening to this as a podcast. I just thought I'd fill everyone in who's watching on YouTube. I'll see you next time.